education. I'm the education chair for the Flatirons Young Farmers Coalition. And FYFC is a chapter of the National Young Farmers Coalition, though that will be changing soon. And we're participating in a grant program from the Boulder County through the Sustainability Fund. So they've awarded us, along with our private donor, the Tumbleweed Foundation, they've awarded us some money to put on these workshops, and we're just really excited to be able to do that for everybody. This series in particular on employment is just seems really timely to me right now. I know there's a lot of young farmers out there starting farms and looking to maybe scale up a little bit or get some help. So I'm excited to help us all do that. I want to just, so Sean, who's here as the Flatirons Young Farmers Coalition, is our tech person today. And she is going to just help us make sure everything runs smoothly. So if you have any questions, you can direct message her in the chat. I wonder, Sean, if my chats from previously are still in that chat box, or if I should put them in. I'd shared a folder and our agenda for the day.
Yeah, let me check on that. And if not, we can just drop them in there again.
Okay, perfect.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. We just have, I think, well, we've got a couple of community guidelines posted for our event today. Hopefully you guys can see them. Please nod if you can. Great. So I won't just to go over them real quick. They're real short. We just ask that you please mute your microphone when someone is presenting or speaking. We'll have time for question and answer at different section breaks, and definitely at the end of all of the presenters that we have. So if you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll get to it at a time where it's appropriate for that. Our third guideline is we ask you to please be considerate of time and space and to allow others to participate and contribute if you have already done so yourself. And finally, if at all possible, if you can be actively present by turning on your video to make it easier for speakers and other attendees to be engaged. Helen, it looks like your schedule that you posted is still in the chat. Do you want to go over any of that, or would you like to just jump right into Jody's presentation?
I just wanted to let people do a couple more things to let folks know kind of what we're here for. I also want to go ahead and read our chapter's mission and vision statements. So I'm going to do that real quickly. So the Young Farmers Coalition is a growing group of farmers and ranchers, beginning, aspiring, established, young and old alike, committed to tending the land and cultivating community. FYFC provides educational and social opportunities for growers to learn and network, and is united as one strong voice in local, state, and national policy work to ensure the future of agriculture. We envision a burgeoning community of successful farms of all sizes and farmers of all experience levels, and we act as a unifying body for those who wish to support local and regenerative agriculture. So I hope that makes you guys feel good about what you're here for today, because we're all doing awesome work, and I'm really excited that you all have joined us. I'm excited to have you guys just learn what there is to know about employing people on your farms, because it's a lot. And just to sort of just to let you know, this is a long session. It's a 4-hour session, and that's because there's a lot to cover. I mean, the topics, just to get started, are quite, extensive. We also have particular laws that are just for agriculture. And so we do have a couple of guest speakers from the Department of Ag and Labor and Employment who are going to come in and talk about recent changes to our ag employment laws, and about some programs that can help you when you're employing people on your farm. But it's really a primer. you know, so you're going to go on from this workshop and you're going to find further resources to help you employ people. But this is meant to give you an overview of the kind of responsibilities, legal responsibilities and requirements that you have as an ag employer. And I just want to also plug, you know, that we are doing a sort of more soft skills workshop in 2 weeks on Saturday, the 26th, which will be about, you know, how do we make farm workplaces really healthy and inviting, and how do we encourage young farmers on our farms? How do we, you know, create careers and build communities with our employees and our employers? So, and then I just thought it might be fun for people to participate real quick if we could just get a show of hands for who has never employed anyone before. So you could use the Jody's never employed anybody. Okay. You can use the hands up on your reactions or just your hand on your video. So, okay, quite a few people have never employed anybody before. Just as some context, Jody. Jade, thank you, Jade. Awesome. Well, I'll let Jody take it away. Jody is graciously supplying us with a lot of his knowledge today. Really appreciate you being here and creating the presentation that you did. The presentation, the PowerPoint presentation that Jody gave us is in your additional resources folder, along with a notes page and a employer's checklist for separation, which was interesting. And there's a lot of other stuff in there too. So hope you'll take a look at that folder, and I will let Jody take it away. Thank you.
All right, good morning, and thank you for being here on Saturday morning. I'm excited to talk to you all, and I was excited when Helen asked if I could do this. I love meeting with ag folks. I come from a farming family, farm Durham wheat, about an hour south of Spokane, Washington. So getting with ag folks is it always warms my soul because I feel like I'm at home. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen here again. I did it once. There we go. Okay. So as I said, my name is Jody Duvall. I'm a labor employment attorney up in Fort Collins. That's me in a suit, obviously. I figured since it's Saturday morning, I could get away with my lumberjack flannel. But if anybody has any issues, just leave a comment in the chat and I can change at the break. My main practice area is labor and employment, including all areas of that entails providing guidance to employers on compliance with the law, doing audits of employer policies, wage and hour issues, employment litigation when employees have disputes, whether they be discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination, those types of things. If it devolves to litigation, I represent employers all the way through the process. Labor relations, a big part of my practice before I moved to Colorado in 2016 was up in Seattle, and I dealt a lot with labor unions. So I have pretty extensive experience dealing with all the issues involved there, labor disputes, collective bargaining, negotiations, things like that. So I kind of cover the waterfront when it comes to labor employment issues, and generally from the employer standpoint. How my information there on the bottom of the slide in case you guys want to contact me after the presentation is over, is right there in your materials. So these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss today. A lot of the issues that face employers, especially new employers who are looking to hire folks. These are issues you want to make sure you're familiar with. We're going to talk about employees versus independent contractors. What's the difference between interns, volunteers, apprentices? We're going to touch on minimum wage and overtime issues, although I understand we have somebody from the Department of Labor coming in. So that's really going to be a primer for their presentation. With that said, it's something that's worth going over twice because it's important and it's not necessarily clear all the time. We're going to talk about non-cash wages, which in the ag context is often present. We're going to talk about tax considerations, things you need to do as an employer, different state law requirements, workers' comp, unemployment, reporting employees, and then We're going to talk about some best employment practices, compliance with immigration law, and recent changes to state law. And this is across all of the presentations I'm going to do today. So I'm not going to try and fit all of this in the first hour section. And as Helen alluded to, this is just kind of touching on some of the issues that you need to be familiar with, but it is just a primer, and all of these issues we could delve much further into. And in addition to these aren't the only issues that you need to be cognizant of as an employer, but these are definitely important ones. So one of the first ones one of the first issues that typically pops up with employers, especially new employers who are looking to possibly save on the front end, is what they should classify their workers as, whether they should be employees or independent contractors. And the applicable law here that's going to cover this issue is the Federal Fair Labor and Standards Act, the FLSA. And the FLSA covers, there's two different types of coverage that can apply for employers. Now you have enterprise coverage, which means it covers the employer and applies to employers with 2 employees and $500,000 in annual business volume. Sometimes if you are not covered as an employer, your employees can be covered through individual coverage as well. So have the same protections of the FLSA as if they work for an employer who's covered under the enterprise coverage prong of the FLSA. And individual employees are covered if their work regularly involves commerce between the states, which is essentially going to be everybody. One thing that comes into play here, the FLSA contains certain exemptions for agricultural employees. So if you're thinking because you're an agricultural employer, you're going to be exempt from the FLSA, you can still be subject to different sections of the FLSA without being exempt from the whole thing. So you're going to still be subject to the employee independent contractor requirements of the FLSA, even if as an agricultural employer, you're exempted from the overtime requirements, minimum wage overtime requirements of the FLSA. So there's a bunch of different tests out there that could come into play with regard to this distinction between employee versus independent contractor. And the main ones are from the IRS, Department of Labor, and then common law, which is the one the courts will apply when there's a dispute. And each one of these agencies has different reasons for why they have different tests or why this is important to them. The IRS, obviously, there will be different tax consequences if the worker is an employee versus an independent contractor. The Department of Labor cares about this because independent contractors are not going to be subject to the minimum wage or overtime requirements of the FLSA. So the key point of all of these tests, though, is control. When the IRS had a test called the 20-point test, they've since changed it, and I think they have 4 different factors they look at now, but they had the 20-point test up until a year or 2 ago, which I still think is probably one of the best tests to look at to figure out what the factors are for what the IRS or really any of these agencies are going to look at when they're trying to determine whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. So some of the points that are going to be examined in making this determination as to whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor: profit or loss. If the worker can make a profit or suffer a loss as a result of their work, that's going to weigh in favor of the worker being considered an independent contractor. Is there an investment there on behalf of the worker? Are they investing in equipment and facilities? Are they bringing their own tools to the job? The greater the investment from the worker, the more likely that the worker is going to be considered an independent contractor. If the worker works for more than one company, that's going to be a big factor in favor of them being considered an independent contractor. If they're restricted to working for just one employer, then that's going to be indicia of employment status as opposed to contracting status. How much control as far as day-to-day instructions do you give to the worker? If you have the right to give the worker instructions about when, where, how to perform the work, that's going to be considered an employment type of relationship as opposed to a contractor relationship. Training, if you're providing training to the worker again, indicia of employment as opposed to independent contractor, because independent contractors are supposed to be already trained or gain their training on their own. How the length of the relationship is going to be something that's going to be considered. If that's a long-term relationship between the worker and the company, it's going to be indicia of employment as opposed to independent contractor. Do you set the worker's hours? If you're setting their schedule, again, indicia of employment as opposed to independent contractor. If you're requiring to do the work on your premises, it's going to look more like an employment relationship. That one's going to go back and forth, because in some circumstances they have to do the work on the premises. In agricultural context, it's not like they can go harvest crops off your property. That one's, but again, something taken into consideration, whether they're doing the work. Pay schedules, whether you're paying the workers' expenses, travel costs, things like that. Those are all going to make it look more like employment as opposed to independent contractor. Who's providing the tools for the worker to do the work? If it's a contractor, most likely the contractor's going to bring his own tools. And then what is the consequence if the worker screws up the job? Are you going to be disciplining the worker? Are you going to be firing them? That all looks more like employment as opposed to independent contractor. If it's a true contracting relationship, then the remedy for you, if they aren't doing the job well enough, is to just terminate the contract.
So Jody, can I just jump in? I just want to see if people are getting this. So let's say that I've hired a friend of mine. I want them to come in and I want them to weed. I just want them to keep my cabbages weed free for the entire season. And other than that, I don't, tell them when they need to do that or how they need to do it. Maybe they can use my tools, but I'm not going to tell them how they have to do it.
Sure.
What would you think about that situation?
So in that situation, the less control that you have over the manner of the work performed, when it's done, things like that, that's all going to weigh in favor of a contracting relationship. One other thing that's important to consider is how integral are the services to the business of the employer. So, if in the example I always use is, if you're a business working in an office building, and you're hiring somebody to come in and clean your building, those services are not integral to the business operations of the company. So that looks more like a contracting relationship as opposed to employee. If it's part of your integral business, so if, let's say you're a company that engages in sales of a product and you're contracting with somebody to come in and sell your product, that's what you do as a business. That's the integral part of your business. So that's going to look more like employment. In this situation, weeding probably is not going to be considered the integral part of your business. It's related to it. You got to have weed-free fields to, increase your profits and grow your crops. But it's not. You're not hiring somebody to come in and do the, see the fields and harvest your crops and sell them. So, I think that's probably fine to consider that type of relationship. If that's all they're doing and you're truly giving them a free hand to do it whenever they want and at their own, however they want to do it, you're probably looking at a defensible independent contractor relationship.
Right. And then if I've got, let's say I really need harvest help, and so I have to have people come in at a certain time on a certain day because I need to harvest my crops on the day before market. So I have them come in and I'm like, harvest all the cabbages, and I need you to do it in this certain way. And then I need you to wash them and pack them into these bins in a certain way. And you need to be here at 6 a.m. to do that and get it done. That looks more like employment.
It does. You're exerting quite a bit of control there. Especially if you have your own employees out there working side by side with the contractors doing the work. If they're just doing work that your own employees do, for you as part of your integral business operations, then it does look more like an employment relationship. With that said, I know that there are farming operations out there, maybe on like the larger scale with like wheat crops and corn crops and things like that, where the farmer doesn't have the tools to do that himself. So he hires, custom cutters to come in and harvest the crop. That's kind of a different situation, because that's really not part of your farming business model. And you're hiring somebody to come and just perform a service for you that you're not really doing on your own. Does that
Awesome.
make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And then I just want to see, could people give me a show of hands, like that you kind of understand the distinction between 1099 employees, that is independent contractors, and a regular employee, what W-2? Can I just get a show of hands? Do you understand? Or with a thumbs up or hands? Okay, awesome. Thanks, you guys. Okay, Jody, go ahead.
Yeah, and this is something you want to make sure that you get right. That has pretty steep penalties too. So if you are classifying somebody as an independent contractor and they should have been classified as an employee, these are generally the penalties that you're going to be exposed to. First, you're going to be responsible for all the back wages that you should have paid them as an employee, because employees are entitled to minimum wage and overtime. If you're just paying a contractor a contract rate that wasn't sufficient to pay minimum wage and overtime for the work they did, you'll be required to pay those back wages. The FLSA also includes a liquidated damages provision, which is essentially double damages. So whatever the back wages are, you're gonna have to double that and pay it to them. Colorado state law has its own statutory penalties, which we have a case that interpreted this a few years ago, where an employee brought a claim under both the FLSA and state law. And the court said you can recover both double damages under the FLSA plus statutory penalties. And Colorado statutory penalties are 125% of the first $7,500 of wages, plus 50% of wages in excess of $7,500. So you can be looking at pretty quickly, have to pay right around triple the wages that are due. And these are all attorney's fee statutes as well. So if you get this wrong, even if it's a small amount of money, a couple $1,000, it can jump up pretty quick into the tens of thousands of dollars. And then attorney's fees on top of that, you could, the hole gets deep really quick. There's also criminal penalties that could be associated with it. Tax penalties, where this comes in is if you fail to withhold payroll taxes, or you don't make Social Security, Medicare tax payments on income that should have been considered income to a W-2 employee, but you paid out as 1099, didn't make any withholdings. You'll have to go back and pay those. There's potential penalties for failing to comply with I-9 requirements. Unemployment insurance is going to want their piece of the unemployment insurance premiums from the wages that you didn't properly pay. Workers' comp back payments of premiums. There's a recent, what I would consider hot enforcement area that you could find yourself on the hook for liability for failing to allow independent contractors to participate in employment benefits if you're providing them to your employees, and you had somebody working as an independent contractor and they weren't allowed to participate in benefits because of that. Back payments to pension retirement plans, health insurance, paid leave, severance pay, those kinds of things. If you have more than 50 employees, you could be subject to FMLA Act violations. And there's a new law that goes into effect in March that increases the potential criminal penalties under Colorado law if you fail to pay wage thefts. If you fail to pay wages before, it would have been considered a misdemeanor. Now, if the amount of the wages at issue is greater than $2,000, it could be considered a felony if you fail to pay those wages. Statute of limitations for any of these wage issues under the FLSA is 2 years for a non-willful violation and 3 years for a willful violation. And you all know about the requirements now, so any violation will be willful. So congratulations. This is something you want to take pretty seriously. Department of Labor audits, whether they be U.S. Department of Labor or Colorado Department of Labor and Employment audits, they can be pretty hairy. They come in and an investigator will give you a notice of the audit, and you will be required to provide up to 3 years of payroll records within 72 hours. And then the investigators on site, talking to employees, conducting interviews, things like that. Something you definitely want to get your attorney involved with right off the bat, because they move really quick and they ramp up, and the penalties are nothing to joke about. And one thing I've seen that is an automatic red flag that will trigger an IRS audit is if you have an employee who you want to change their classification to independent contractor. And I see this more often than you would think. I get clients who call and say, hey, I've got this guy who's doing this work for me. We're in agreement that we just want to change his status to 1099 and call him an independent contractor. The reason they do this is because it saves money for everybody. And the employee doesn't have to pay, the employer and the employee don't have to pay certain payroll taxes. So I think it's a money saving measure. But if you do that, if you change somebody from a W-2 employee to an independent contractor and submit a W-2 and a 1099 to the IRS for the same person the same year, that's an immediate red flag. You can pretty much count on being audited that year. And all of these agencies share information. So federal IRS, the Department of Labor, and the state of Colorado, they have all entered into an agreement where they share information amongst themselves if there's a violation. So you can count on, if any of these agencies audit you and they find a violation, that the other agencies are going to get notification of it, and they will want their piece of the pie as well.
I have a quick question. So what would you suggest if somebody, like I know a lot of people in farming that use 1099 contractors, like what would you suggest they do if they learn, I think a lot of people, yeah, you're right. Like they just say, oh, I want the savings. And then I find that a lot of people don't understand what they're doing and like the seriousness of it. And what would you suggest they do to avoid getting a massive scary audit if they like just learned about the serious consequences and want to change?
I think it depends on the time of year.
Okay.
My recommendation is always compliance as soon as you learn of a violation. So if you've been engaged in a practice that all of a sudden, you're like, oh crap, maybe that's not what I should have been doing. Compliance as soon as possible, and looking back through payroll records and trying to make the employee whole for any back wages that you should have paid them, whether it be overtime or something like that. That is going to be able to show that if you get audited, you'll be able to sort of good faith defense. As soon as we found out about this issue, we in good faith complied with the law, and here's what we did. And you can't assert that good faith defense if you're relying on legal counsel and or like you just mentioned, if you find out about a practice that may not be in complete compliance with the law and you change immediately, you can't assert those good faith defenses and potentially avoid penalties. Some of these penalties are discretionary, and the Department of Labor can choose not to impose them. So I always recommend compliance as soon as possible. With that said, if you figure this out on like December 20th, do it on January 1st. So that you're not submitting a 1099 and a W-2 in the same year.
Okay. And then, yeah, like in terms of paying that, you've probably not paid a lot of payroll tax and other sort of taxes in terms of like giving that chunk to the government. There's no, like, there's no way to do that, right? Like you can't really, so good faith effort would just be like, okay, just pay your employee what they deserve. And like, that is as much as you probably need to go. I understand you probably should use an attorney, but
yeah, I would say contact an attorney and,
okay.
Get some advice on what you can do to reduce potential liability or risk of an audit from one of the agencies that's going to want a piece of the pie.
Could you fire that contractor and then just hire them as an employee? Like, does that also?
That's going to expose you to the same liability.
Okay.
If you've been engaging in, if you've had a worker who was a contractor and they should have been considered an employee, either way, whether you terminate that agreement or not, you were potentially violating the law during that period of work where they worked for you. So
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
you know, the only way that you can be sure that you'll be safe is if you comply with the law and you do it for at least 3 years and you're beyond the period of statute of limitations.
Gotcha. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
That's why quick compliance is the best, because it gets to that statute of limitations sooner. The Department of Labor has offered a lifeline here. If you have questions about any of these issues, they crank out these opinion letters, which are fact-specific responses to questions that are submitted by employers to the department. They're not binding on courts that are applying the FLSA, but they're given deference. And if an employer relies on an opinion letter, that can be another basis for a good faith defense to liability. Recent opinion letters address things like compensability of rest breaks and required wage deductions or permissible wage deductions for full day absences, compensability of travel time, things like that. So it's a great place to check if you have a wage or salary question that could be affected by the FLSA. And I put the link there for the opinion letters on the slide. If you ever have a question about an issue, whether you're complying with the law, you can always request an opinion letter. There are pros and cons to that. The pros are that it gives you concrete guidance from the Department of Labor that you can rely upon. Cons are that you shine a flashlight on your issue, and you know, you may not want to do that. In that situation, it could be helpful to loop in an attorney, because attorneys can submit a request for an opinion letter without revealing the identity of the client. The Department of Labor also issues administrative interpretations, which are similar to opinion letters, but they're more general guidance regarding the law's application as opposed to specific fact-based responses to fact-based questions. Both are helpful and both can be found on the Department of Labor website. Jumping into interns, volunteers, apprentices. This is always a tricky issue for employers, especially ag employers that bring folks in as either interns or apprentices. The essentially internship is going to be a temporary position for job training. You're looking for something that is in conjunction with an educational program. So, something through CSU or CU, Northern Colorado, something that's tied to an educational program. If they're getting credits through an educational program for the work, you're pretty safe to assume that that's going to be a legitimate internship. Can be for profit or nonprofit entities, and it can be paid or unpaid. Whether an intern should be paid, the FLSA governs, or whether we consider an internship, the FLSA governs, and the test is called the primary beneficiary test. Who is the real beneficiary of the situation? And the factors that the Department of Labor would look at is that both parties have to understand there's no expectations of compensation. It can be paid or unpaid. And if you pay, then that kind of changes this factor. But it complements rather than displaces the work of employers' employees. So if you're hiring somebody to step in and perform actual business essential functions, that's probably not going to be considered an internship. You're not looking for somebody who's going to replace an employee, but somebody who can shadow and learn from your employees. That's what the essential function of an intern is. Again, tied to an educational program. The focus is on the educational benefit for the intern, not the profit of the employer. Again, if the reason you're doing this is to increase your profitability, then that's probably not going to be considered an internship, and there can be no expectation of job at the end. Volunteers.
I have one
Yeah.
quick question, Cody. So if I'm I feel like, but let's say I have a person who I'm calling an intern, right?
Okay.
I'm calling the position an internship,
Mhm.
but I'm paying the minimum wage, and they're doing like the work of the farm, right? And they're an employee, and I have my W-2, and I'm paying taxes for them and everything. Like, it's okay for me to call it an internship. Is that right?
Yeah, because if there were ever any issues, and the Department of Labor said, "Oh no, you should be calling them an intern," the damages that you would be required to pay them would be minimum wage and overtime. So if you're complying with all the wage laws anyway, then it doesn't matter what you call them.
Okay, but it doesn't mean that if I call it an internship that I can just not pay the minimum wage.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So volunteers, this is an issue, another issue I get more often than you would imagine. Volunteers can't work for for-profit private entities. So, I'll have clients who will come up and say, oh, that person is just volunteering here last week. Well, you can't volunteer at a private company. Volunteers are limited to nonprofit entities. And if you're not a nonprofit, don't even cross this bridge. So that's the kind of the thing to take home. I'm assuming that none of you are nonprofit entities, since you're all planning on being private for-profit entities. So don't hire or don't refer to somebody as a volunteer, and make sure you're paying everybody unless they're a legitimate intern.
Jody, I had a question. So I'm assuming later on we'll talk about this, but I think, when I think of volunteers, I think of the WOOF program. Like, I'm sure all of us have done that in this country and other countries. And it's like this pretty casual relationship where you essentially get housing and food and you work on someone's farm. And I don't know that a lot of us here do that, but it's pretty common if you travel. And I'm just I wonder if, so like, even if you did give them housing and food, you would have to, it's still, yeah, I guess that's how they justify it, right? Is like they pay for that housing, they pay for the utilities, and the value of that food is going to their employee, volunteer. But yeah, how do you sort of figure that one out?
So we'll talk about that here. One of the sections that's coming up, but those are called non-cash wages. And there are specific requirements to use non-cash wages. They're pretty prevalent in the ag industry because, like you said,
Totally.
or providing commodities or housing or something like that instead of payments for wages.
Right.
So we'll touch on that here in a minute, but that is a good point. If those aren't true volunteer positions. If it's a for-profit company, then it's not going to be a true volunteer position.
That's a really good point. And I've been sort of doing research into the insurance implications of volunteers too. And it's definitely something that I think all of us should consider in terms of especially if all these veggie farms have volunteer days. It's definitely a little more complicated than it seems. I'm learning in terms of, because those volunteers, I guess something happens to them, could be kind of messy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings into play insurance aspects and all that sort of stuff. So I would the point to take home with the volunteers is if you're a for-profit company, just don't even dip your toe in. So apprenticeships, they're generally formal training programs where workers are getting experience and knowledge by working for an employer. Apprentices have to receive at least minimum wage set forth in the FLSA for hours that they spend working. I would recommend, if you have apprentices, that you have a written agreement that spells out all of the aspects and details of the apprenticeship. The purpose is apprentices are supposed to be gaining and using skills while working for an employer. If they're working for you for a long period, you should set forth in the written agreement, how and when they're going to receive wage increases. All the stuff should be reflected in the agreement. If the apprentice is doing the work of one of your full-time professional employees, then they should be receiving the same pay as those full-time professional employees. One thing to keep in mind: not all hours that are spent by an apprentice are entitled to compensation. So time spent learning in a classroom or other forms of instruction in which the apprentices are not actually working, they're not necessarily going to be entitled to compensation for those hours. If the employees are going to receive compensation for those instructional type of hours, that apprenticeship agreement should specify all of these details in writing. So this is a section that the Department of Labor is going to come in and present on as well, but I wanted to touch on it because, like I said, there've been a lot of changes in the last couple of years, and it's very detailed, and you want to make sure you're complying with the exact requirements of the law. Otherwise, you could find yourself in hot water. So this is just kind of prep you for the presentation from the Department of Labor presenter, but I think it's important to at least touch on it a couple times to make sure that we're all comfortable with it. So Colorado law sets forth minimum wage and overtime requirements for all Colorado employers. And it issues what they call a comps order every year. And this year, the comps order that sets the minimum wage and overtime requirements is called Comps Order 38. And there's a huge change in Colorado minimum wage and overtime law, starting with Comps Order 36, and that has carried through the 37 and 38. Before Comps Order 36, Colorado's minimum wage and overtime laws only applied to industries, to 4 specific industries. If you're outside of those industries, then you just had to make sure you're complying with the federal FLSA and you were good. Now Colorado law, Comps Order 38, the current one in effect, covers all industries. And essentially the way it works is you can have state law and federal law that cover the same issues, and you will have to comply with whichever one is more strict. Whichever one provides more protection to the employees is going to apply. In this case, pretty much across the board, Colorado law is going to be stricter. And so that's what employers are going to have to comply with. We're going to talk about non-agricultural workers first, because even as agricultural employers, you may have, office folks or people who aren't working in the field who may not be considered agricultural workers. And you're going to have to comply with these other requirements of the law for non-agricultural workers. So
one brief question about that, Jody.
yeah.
I've also read that, even though I have, on farm work can be really diverse, right? So let's say I've got somebody who helps me harvest flowers. I'm a flower farmer. She helps me harvest flowers in the morning, and then in the afternoon, she actually puts together bouquets for me. And then she drives to market and does my market stall in the afternoon. Some of that is non-agricultural work. Is that right?
Yeah, so what you're going to want to look at is what are the primary duties, and that's kind of what the Department of Labor and a court would look at. Is what are this employee's primary duties? Are they non-agricultural in nature or agricultural? Agricultural workers may have some aspects of their job that are non-agricultural in nature, and that's fine as long as their primary duty remains agricultural. And the flip is the same too. So you're going to want to look at that. And it's not, well, the Department of Labor will look at what you're spending more time doing. That's not necessarily going to be a dispositive test, but you want to look at, how many hours they're spent doing agricultural work, how many are spent doing non-agricultural work, what they're doing, what the purpose of their job is, whether they're making you the most money, that type of thing. So you're gonna want to look at it, and it may make sense. It's a very fact specific inquiry. It may make sense to loop in an attorney or contact the Department of Labor and get some assistance if you have a situation that is really not clear and you need some help kind of classifying as either agricultural or non-agricultural.
Or maybe just assume that you have a non-agricultural employee.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. The non-agricultural requirements are stricter than agricultural. So if you're complying with that, then you'll be fine either way. So for non-agricultural workers, there's a further subdivision into exempt or non-exempt workers. If you're an exempt non-agricultural worker, you'll be exempt from the minimum wage and overtime requirements. To be exempt, you have to meet all 3 of these requirements. You have to be paid a salary on a salary basis, which means that your salary is going to be the same every pay period, regardless of the quantity or quality of work that you perform. You have to be paid at least a minimum salary threshold, which in Colorado, they've jacked up the salary threshold. It's going to keep increasing as is set forth on this slide through 2024. So that the ultimate salary threshold is going to be $54,000 in 2024. Then after that, it's going to adjust based on the consumer price index, the same consumer price index that adjusts minimum wage every year. But you have to pay on a salary basis. You have to pay at least the salary threshold that's on the slide. And then your employee has to meet one of the duties tests that would qualify for exemption. And these are traditionally called the white collar exemptions. These are executives, administratives, professional workers, things like that. So they've got to meet the duties, be paid a salary, and be paid a specific level of a salary threshold to be considered exempt. And if they aren't exempt, then they've got to be paid at least the minimum wage for every hour worked, and overtime for all hours worked over 40 in a week, 12 in a day, or 12 in a shift, even if the shift goes over 2 days. You also have to provide rest breaks to non-agricultural workers under ComSorta 38. You have to provide a 30-minute unpaid lunch break if the shift is longer than 5 hours, a 10-minute paid break for every 4-hour segment of work or major fraction thereof. And this was a change this year for ComSorta 38. If you don't provide those 10-minute paid breaks, then you have to add an additional 10 minutes of pay onto an employee's paycheck. As I mentioned, there's overtime requirements for non-exempt, non-agricultural workers, time and a half the regular rate of pay for all hours over 40 a week, 12 in a day, or shifts that are longer than 12, even if they span 2 days. One thing to keep in mind, the regular rate of pay includes most amounts paid, and there are pay periods where it will line up and be the hourly rate for your employees. That's not always the case. If you pay a bonus, if you pay a discretionary bonus, that's going to be not included in the regular rate of pay. But if you pay a non-discretionary bonus, it is going to be included in the regular rate of pay. And it's that total amount that you pay in a pay period that's divided by the amount of hours that they work. It's going to be considered the regular rate of pay. That's what you base your overtime calculation off of. So there are situations, especially around the holidays, where employers pay like performance bonuses to employees who hit a certain threshold throughout the year. Then they pay them a year-end bonus, but they don't take that into consideration when they're calculating overtime, where you can find yourself in hot water for not paying all of the wages that employees do. So non-agricultural workers, that's the requirements for them. Agricultural workers, the ComSorta 38 brought in a lot of new changes for agricultural workers. The biggest and most immediate issue is minimum wage. There's no longer an exemption for agricultural workers. It has to be paid to all employees who are not considered range workers. Range workers are defined in the FLSA as employees who are principally engaged in the range production of livestock on the open range and are provided without cost or deduction housing, food, transport, and equipment required for H-2A visa range workers by federal regs. So unless you have an employee who meets the statutory definition of a range worker, they've all got to be paid minimum wage in Colorado as of January 1st, 2022. This year, minimum wage is $12.56 an hour. Another big change that was brought in by ComSorta 38 is overtime for ag workers. And this is going to be phased in over the next 4 years. And it essentially has to be paid to all employees unless they're one of your relatives. And the permissible relatives are listed on the slide there as far as who doesn't have to be paid overtime.
Can you explain, sorry, could you explain range worker one more time? Is this like folks that are, I know like in Colorado, there's a lot of like Peruvian sheep herders that kind of nomadically travel through the range. So it would be that kind of person like that provides their own house, like they usually have a trailer for housing and they, take care of their own food and everything. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
Yeah, it's ranch hands. People who live and work on a ranch and are provided housing and food and board by their employer.
Really? So like if you were like any agricultural, like livestock enterprise, any ranch that employs people, those people are considered range workers?
Yeah, I would want to look at it on a case-by-case basis to make sure that the person is considered a range worker, but that's generally what you're looking at. are
Really?
ranch hands who live on the ranch and spend their whole day out with livestock, and they're provided food and board by the employer.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, thank you.
So the other thing you're gonna have to take a look at with regard to overtime for ag workers is what your classification is. If you're a highly seasonal employer, non-highly seasonal employer, or a small employer, your obligations are going to change with regard to when overtime is going to be phased in for you and how much you're going to have to pay. So a highly seasonal ag employer is classified as an employer who during any 22-week work week period, or if you have 2 or 3 periods during the year that add up to 23 or 22 weeks, you had at least twice as many employees as the rest of the year. Those are going to be considered highly seasonal employers. Small employers, anybody with fewer than 4 employers on average over the previous 3 years, or had an adjusted gross income. It's not an or, it's an and. So fewer than 4 employees on average over the previous 3 years, and adjusted gross income over the 3 prior years preceding 2024 of no more than $1 million. So if you don't fall into either one of those categories, you'll be considered a non-highly seasonal employer. And your requirements for paying the overtime, it's the same for everybody through 2023. So until November 1st, 2022, this year, there's no requirement for overtime for ag employees. Between November 1st, 2022 and December 31st, 2023, you'll have to pay overtime after 60 hours in a work week, regardless of your classification. After 2024, it starts to, or during 2024, it starts to, you see the separation between highly seasonal employers, non-highly seasonal employers, and small employers, and your obligations. As a highly seasonal employer, you have to pay overtime after 56 hours during your 22 peak weeks. The rest of the time will be 48 hours. Non-highly seasonal after 54 hours in 2024, and then in 2025 after 48 hours. So you can see they're slowly ratcheting down the number of hours after which you have to pay overtime. And small employers, after 56 hours in 2024, you have to pay overtime. And then whichever rule applies thereafter for highly seasonal or non-highly seasonal employees. So you're gonna have to figure out what your classification is before you're gonna be able to figure out what your obligations are for overtime. But know that there is going to be some requirement for you to pay overtime at some point based on your classification. Nothing until November 1st of this year, and then it changes each year or essentially each year for a couple of years. So make sure you understand your classification and what your obligation is going to be going forward.
And then Jody,
yeah.
Overtime pay. So it's always like after that threshold, for the hours worked after that threshold, I'm paying 1.5 times the hourly rate. Is that right? Or
1.5 times the regular rate of pay, okay. Which, like I said, frequently is going to be their hourly wage, but sometimes it can be different. If there are other amounts that you're paying them throughout the year, you're going to have to include those amounts into the calculation before you can figure out the regular rate of pay.
I also have another question. So I've heard of there's a lot of people who do like a stipend situation where it's like every single month you just get the same amount of money. Would that be considered, in this case, like it's hard to even, you're not even tracking hours really, so you don't even really know if you're going overtime. So is that, does that sort of indicate like, oh, that's not like you should be doing hourly, everyone should be, is there any regulations on that?
So they're just paying a stipend?
Yeah, it's I think it's pretty, actually most of the jobs I've ever worked on farms are stipends. Yeah, they'll just be like, it's this much money per month. You just work, and it kind of just works. And I think sometimes people get pissed off at how many hours they're working, but like in general, it kind of just all evens out. So is that, yeah, are there any regulations based on that? Like, does it have to be hourly?
So then with the new requirement to pay minimum wage, the stipend, the employer should be tracking work hours, because you can't calculate how much you're paying your employees on an hourly basis unless you track their work hours. So that may have worked beforehand, but with the new requirements, with no exemptions for ag employees from the minimum wage requirement, that's probably not going to work anymore to not track hours. So you should be tracking hours, and then the stipend will have to be enough to pay minimum wage for all the hours worked. So
okay.
If it's not enough, if you're paying, if you work the stipend out, if you divide the amount of stipend by the total hours worked that month, and it only works out to $9 an hour, you're going to be liable for, not paying all the wages that you owe your employees.
Gotcha. And in that case, it's like, why keep the stipend the same? It's like, yeah, because sometimes you'd be wasting money, and then other times you'd be not following the law.
Right.
And
also, like, then if you were going to do it, if it was going to be a stipend, it would have to actually be like a salary, right? Which has this really high threshold for how much you have to pay somebody for them to work as many hours as you want. Do I have that kind of right, Jody?
So those salary thresholds only apply to exempt employees. So you're not going to be stuck with those salary thresholds that were on the slide unless they could qualify for one of the white collar exemptions. So that's essentially going to rule out all jobs that are mainly manual labor. But with that said, you can still pay hourly employees a salary. It gets really murky because the hourly rate is going to change each pay period because they're going to be working different amounts of hours. And if once overtime gets thrown into it, the calculation, I mean, it's a massive administrative burden if you're just paying a salary to hourly workers. So I always recommend, I mean, you can do it. I would make sure that you talk to an attorney before you set it up to make sure that you understand all the risks in your particular situation. But once overtime kicks in for agricultural employers, it's gonna really make it difficult if you have employees who are working overtime to figure out what you should properly be paying them and complying with all wage laws. So I guess my thoughts are with the stipend, if you're paying a stipend and it's sufficient to cover minimum wage for all of the hours worked for the employees, which you need to track those hours. Otherwise you'll have no defense if you get a Department of Labor audit and somebody goes to the Department of Labor and says, hey, they haven't been paying me minimum wage, and you don't have any records of their hours that they've worked. One, that's going to be its own separate violation of the law that you're going to be subject to a statutory penalty for. Two, you're not going to have any defense to the employee's claim that they weren't paid minimum wage because you don't have any records. And so the Department of Labor is going to take that into account, and all they'll have is the employee's word that they weren't paid enough. So you should be tracking the hours of all of your employees who are entitled to minimum wage. But back to what I was saying, if you pay a stipend and it's easily enough to cover minimum wage for all of your employees during that time period, I don't have any issues with that, but just have that in the back of your mind that if it ever drops below minimum wage, if you divide that stipend out over the hours worked and it drops below minimum wage, you're going to be on the hook for wage violations, which can unleash a whole host of terribles. But once overtime is mixed into the situation as well, so after November of this year, it's going to become so administratively burdensome. I would recommend against it. And if you're going to continue to pay a stipend, make sure that you talk to an attorney and you understand how it affects your situation, what liabilities could be there, how you're going to make sure that you're accounting for proper payment of overtime on top of the hourly minimum wage hourly amount that you have to pay. So yeah, it's the changes in the wage law are going to bring in some pretty significant changes for the ag industry.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, gosh, I know, like, so many people are going to need to fix their systems. I'm wondering, are these audits are they like tax audits where there's like red flags or random sort of like you're just chosen to be audited? Or is it generally based on like a complaint or like how, I mean, it's going to be kind of, for lack of a better term, a shit show for like a couple of years. Because like, I know a lot of people that are not going to grab onto this super quickly, So yeah, is it just random that they'll get audited, or how would that work?
There's two ways that they typically get triggered. There's in response to a complaint, an employee complaint, and those usually come from disgruntled employees who leave and go to the Department of Labor and say, hey, just so you know, this person's not paying minimum wage. They're anonymous complaints. You'll never find out who it was. And, you know, I've been with employers who that really irritates them, that they can't figure out who it was that complained. But it'll be an anonymous complaint. The other triggering mechanism is the Department of Labor will target industries, because it's an industry by industry problem. And you'll see it. I know that, you know, one of the industries that I've seen a lot of improper classification of independent contractor versus employee is like the hairstyling industry. A lot of those hair salons have all of the people who are in the cutting hair are independent contractors, and they should be considered employers or employees. So, and, you know, I've talked to multiple hair salon owners and said, well, this is how they're doing it across the street, you know? So it's an industry problem, and the Department of Labor will get wind of it, and they'll just start targeting employers in those industries. But that's how they usually get started.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. I'm glad that we're hearing this.
And, you know, it's when there's a change in the law like this that really affects one industry, like this is directed at the ag industry, the new changes to the wage law. You know, the Department of Labor, they know that it's also directed at the ag industry, and they're going to be hot on making some examples out of some ag employers so that everybody falls in line. Now, I don't know if the Department of Labor presenter will say the same thing as I do, but that's what I've seen in my practice. She'll probably tell you that they never make examples out of people. She might tell you they do. I don't know. Compliance with the law, though, is what you want to do here. So talking about ag workers, more changes for overtime. If you're a highly seasonal employer, there's going to be disclosure requirements. There are initial disclosure requirements to your employees that overtime pay will be after 56, not 48 hours for those 22 peak weeks. You have to provide when the peak weeks are going to occur, at least a good faith estimate of when they will occur, whether they're going to be divided up. You have to provide these notices at least 30 days in advance of the first expected peak week. They have to be written notices in English and any language that more than 5% of your workforce speaks. So just make sure that you have a good understanding of what your classification is under the new wage law, because there's going to be a lot of potential areas where you could have a violation unintentionally or inadvertently. One thing to keep in mind here, none of these ag rules or exemptions apply if you get at least 50% of your annual business volume from direct sales to the consuming public. So if you're doing like farmers markets, or if you have like a U-pick operation where people come out and you know, you're dealing directly with the consuming public, and you get more than 50% of your annual volume from that, none of these ag rules apply. You're going to have to comply with the non-ag worker requirements. So minimum wage, and then 40 hours, overtime after 40 hours in a work week requirements. So one additional thing to keep in mind. Non-cash wages, and this is what we were touching on before. Does anybody have any more questions about the minimum wage and overtime? And again, Department of Labor is going to come in and talk about this too. So, but I think, as you can see, this is an important enough thing that we should touch on it a couple times.
I just want to, I mean, that last point is actually really important, I think, for a lot of our members who operate CSAs or who are at market. Because if you're getting, like Jody just said, you know, if most of your money is coming from sales directly to a consumer, it doesn't matter. You have to just do regular overtime, is what it sounds like to me, and minimum wage. There's no exemptions just because you're in an agricultural setting.
Yeah.
Do I have that right?
Exactly. And the minimum wage thing is for all employees. So there's no more ag exemptions for minimum wage in Colorado.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. Regular overtime. So after 40 hours in a week, shake my whole computer. After 40 hours in a week, and then, you know, rest breaks and meal periods and things like that. So none of the ag rules apply. You're just a regular employer.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, if I'm, let's say, and I know flowers are a little bit different, but if I'm just wholesaling flowers, so I'm selling business to business, you know, commodity thing, then my workers could be considered like, you know, if I'm getting, you know, more than 50% of my revenue from that kind of sale, then I could maybe take advantage of some of the exemptions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because you're not engaging in retail sales to the direct consuming public.
Okay.
Non-cash wages. This is what Taylor mentioned earlier. Very prevalent in the ag industry. There's this ag employers tax guide that I put the link up there. It's publication 51. I would recommend everybody take a look through it and spin through it and see for yourself some of the rules that apply. But we're going to touch on this issue of non-cash wages to replace FLSA wages that you're required to pay under Colorado law as well. So to qualify as wages, here's the definition of FLSA that they have to meet. They have to be non-cash wages that are furnished regularly by the employer to his employees, or if the same or similar facilities are customarily furnished by other employees engaged in the same or similar trade, business, or occupation in the same or similar communities. We're going to dig into what that means a little bit here in a second, but you know, essentially we're talking about board if the employer is providing housing on the property, you know, food and lodging, other facilities, anything that's not, or anything that's customarily furnished by the employer to his employees. This isn't going to include things like, you know, pizza after work on a Friday. That's not going to be considered wages, but like lodging, daily meals, shares of crops, those may be considered wages under the FLSA. If they're non-cash wages that are furnished in violation of the law. So if you're providing housing that's not in an area that's zoned residential, or if you're providing housing that violates your obligations, you know, doesn't meet the standards of housing that you need to provide under the law as a landlord, that would be considered furnished in violation of law and wouldn't be considered non-cash wages under the FLSA. Scrip is prohibited, and this is something that you know, this is old-timey way of paying wages. We don't really see it anymore, but you know, in Colorado, where we typically saw scrip was back in the day when we had mining companies that would run a whole town up in the mountains, and they'd have a company store and they'd pay you in credits that were only good at the company store. You can't pay in scrip anymore. You have to be, these non-cash wages have to be given free and clear. You can't receive a kickback. Example of a kickback would be if you were providing tools to an employee as non-cash benefits, but that you then require the employee to use in performance of the job. That would be a kickback benefit to the employer. And what's going to be considered as non-cash wages that you can credit against what you are required to pay is the reasonable cost to the employer. So the FLSA regulations specifically say, as far as commodities are concerned, the fair price of commodities that are offered for sale is going to be the reasonable cost that you credit against wages owed to the employee. So these are the requirements that the Department of Labor has put out there. If you're going to claim this credit against wages for non-cash wages, is, like I said earlier, they have to be regularly provided by the employer or similar employers in the industry. They have to be voluntarily accepted by the employee. There can be no coercion from the employer to accept the non-cash wages. If the employee wants cash, you got to pay cash. If you approach the employee and say or imply that you can only provide a commodity or some other type of non-cash wage, that's not going to be considered voluntarily accepted by the employee. The Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division has issued an opinion letter. It's WH 513 that says voluntary acceptance of a job can be construed as voluntary acceptance of the facilities only when the facilities are integral to performing the job. And the example they give is with room and board for a live-in housekeeper or a babysitter. And the employee understands this when accepting the job. So the voluntariness is huge. Investigators, if you're ever subject to an audit, are going to be looking for some type of an employment agreement where the employee agreed to accept the non-cash wages. As just mentioned, they have to be furnished in compliance with federal, state, and local law. Substandard housing provided by an employer in light of landlord-tenant laws. is not going to qualify, not zoned for residential use. If you're operating like a worker camp that violates permit requirements or something like that, it's not going to be considered non-cash wages. It has to be, non-cash wages have to be primarily for the benefit of the employee rather than the employer. So one thing you want to ask yourself when you're providing these non-cash wages is whose needs are being met here. If you're paying these out because you as an employer are cash poor, but you're commodity rich, it's probably not going to be considered for the benefit of the employee. One other thing you got to keep in mind here, accurate records are required. You have to have itemized accounts that show the nature and the amount of any expenditures when you're entering the computation of reasonable cost. If you don't have any records to support credit for these non-cash wages, you haven't met the requirements of the law to keep your records. So you have to show on a work week basis the deductions from your cash wages that are due to non-cash wages that you're paying to employees. So record keeping is extremely important here, and you'll probably want to talk to a CPA or an attorney to make sure that you completely understand what records are required and what you have to do. There are benefits to paying non-cash wages. They're not subject to Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, or income tax withholding, but they're still subject to income tax. So you want to make sure that when you agree to do this with your employee, that they still have enough to pay the income tax on the non-cash wages. One of the benefits to employees is that they can then market these commodities on their own, potentially make more money than they otherwise would have. And it's a good way for you to get your employees to buy into the success of the operation.
Can you give an example of that, Jody? Just like a commodity sharing agreement?
Yeah, so if you agree with your employee to, if you're an apple farmer and you agree to sell or to provide 10 bushels of apples to the employee in exchange for however many hours of work. So that's the type of agreement that we're talking about here, but you want to have this all spelled out, what you're going to be providing and how much work it's going to be equivalent wages for.
Okay, I've got another question on that topic. So like, for example, with meat, each cut is given a premium. So like at a farm store, a steak is going to cost probably like $20, and so I've seen the situation where the employee has like $100 to spend in the farm store each month, but they're paying like a premium price for that. It's like, so is that something that would be allowed? Or is that like a reasonable cost? Like, what is a reasonable cost?
So as a commodity, the meat's going to be whatever its commodity price is. There should be you should be able to figure out, but based on the market, what the market price of the commodity is. That's going to be the reasonable cost in that situation. So is your question,
so yeah,
paid in like a script type of a situation where they're being paid company store wages? Or
exactly.
wages
Yeah,
that only be redeemed at the company store?
Yes, that actually does happen quite a bit. And I see, but the thing is like the prices of those, it's like the prices of the commodities that they're offering are the retail price. So like the retail price is like $30 a pound for like steak, or like $10 or $12 a pound for ground beef or something. And it's like, well, I could have just used that money and bought myself, had the employee chosen, I could just go to the grocery store and get 3 times that amount of ground beef. But now I'm kind of forced to like consume and purchase at this premium price. So are you saying like there's like a sort of baseline commodity price for like all ground beef that you should be charging?
So I guess my first, just kind of unspooling that circumstance, I think there's a problem with paying them you're paying them in script in that situation.
Yeah, you are.
You're requiring them to use their credits to buy commodities from you at the company store. That's prohibited under the FLSA.
Okay, so that could be like a perk, but that couldn't be like factored into their wage.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
That might be something, a benefit of working. Hey, we'll let you buy from us, but you still have to pay them wages. And if the employer wants to be paid cash, then you have to pay them in cash.
Right.
If you're saying if the only way we're going to pay you is through these credits at the company store, you got a whole host of other problems as opposed to trying to figure out what the commodity price is. There are indexes that provide commodity prices that you can turn to for, wheat, corn, apples, beef, whatever your commodity is. You can figure that out, referring to some sort of baseline price index. And there are different ones you can use. I would, if the employee agrees to accept the commodity instead of cash wages, you should list out what they're agreeing to accept and what the price of that's going to be in the employee agreement.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
If you're forcing them to buy commodities from you as their wages, then that's coercive, and I think that's a wage law violation.
Okay, because I felt like
Sam, can I just love how much you're smiling right now.
it happens so much. It is
my God,
it
we're
is,
gonna explode all the farm operations.
I know.
Cool.
It happened. Like, I've been paid straight up in ground beef before. Like, that was like part of my life for a long time.
Mhm.
So it's just interesting now to
And you didn't have an option to get paid in cash?
No, and it was like really expensive beef, we're not selling commodity beef. We're selling like really local, small produced, highest end beef you could find. And I'm have to pay, I'm getting paid. Or, this is another one too that's interesting, and I hope you'll go over this, is like the like price of the housing is like some, I've been in areas where it's like, this community is super expensive, but this is like a really crappy house that I'm offering you, but we're in this super expensive valley where it's really hard to find housing, so we're going to offer it to you at $1,000 a month and trade you, and that's your wage, and I'm like, what? This is just like this wouldn't be worth $1,000 outside of this situation. So
that's a great segue into this slide.
Great.
This is a huge risk that employers take. For commodities, it's fairly straightforward. You can look at price indexes and figure out what the price of the commodity is. For things like housing, the Secretary of Labor has the authority to determine the fair value of the non-cash wages. So if you're providing $500 a month housing and trying to credit yourself $1,500 a month for that housing, and one of your employees goes to make a complaint, Secretary of Labor can come in and say, this is expensive. This is, right outside of Boulder. We all know how expensive Boulder is, but you're making them live in a tough shed, So the Secretary of Labor can come in and determine that fair value. And if it's not a commodity and you're hosing your employees with what you're crediting against their wages, you're exposing yourself to quite a bit of risk.
And would it be, so if the farmer otherwise wouldn't have rented out the house to another person that's not working on their farm, is that housing technically considered like equal to other housing? Like, say you've got a house on a farm, across the street you've got another house that's not on a farm, and that place is worth $1,000 a month to rent. But on your farm, you only rent it to your employees. So you're not even in the open market. Like, you're not considering renting it to just anybody. So is it still considered $1,000 a month?
As long as that's a fair value of the benefit that you're providing.
Okay.
And, one other thing.
Not determined. I mean, are there indexes or something for how much housing should cost, or like, how am I supposed to sort of value my on-farm housing?
You could get an appraiser out there if you really wanted to belt and suspenders it and get some documentation you could rely on for like a good faith defense. If you're concerned about that, have a real estate appraiser give you a written appraisal of what it should be renting out for, and keep that in your records. And that way, if the Department of Labor ever comes and says you're gouging your employees with what you're crediting yourself for this, you can say, no, well, I got this real estate appraisal that said this is what I should be renting it for, and that's all I'm crediting myself for. So you just want to make sure that you're documenting it. Make sure there's some sort of contemplative process, and you're looping in the situation like a renting a house, loop in a real estate professional if you're concerned about it, get documentation and rely on the documentation, then you can assert a good faith defense if you're ever subject to an audit.
Here's
It's hard-
another. Oh, go ahead, Chris Ann.
Go ahead,
it's
guys.
hard in this county because if that example you gave Taylor, like that house probably can't be rented to anybody based on our land use codes, but it can be rented as a ag unit.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you can't rent it based on the land use code or the zoning, then you can't use those non-cash wages anyways, because you'll be renting it out in violation of the law.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, snap.
Yeah. So, okay. Here's another.
And that goes back to
all
this.
falling down.
Let's see, that third point, furnished in
Uh-huh.
compliance with federal, state, and local law. So if you're providing housing in an area that's not zoned for residential housing, then it's not going to count.
As a
Okay.
potential wage.
What about a trailer? If you had just purchased, if you like have already purchased this like crappy trailer, then you're technically does a trailer count as a violation of residential zoning?
In this county, yeah.
Does it? Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's on wheels or not.
Does-
Okay, we're past that now. Okay. I was just wondering, like otherwise, okay, say it was residentially zoned, you have a trailer, it's old, you already bought it a long time ago, and you've already paid it off. It's not costing you anything to have that trailer. Or, I mean, honestly, even a house, like it's already paid off and I guess that doesn't really matter. It's just the value of it, right?
Well, you still have to make sure that it would be something that wouldn't expose you to liability if you were a landlord renting it out. So you still have obligations as far as the standards of housing you have to provide as a landlord. And if it's something that you couldn't rent out as a landlord under Colorado law, you're violating your warranty of habitability or something like that, then it's not going to be available to use as non-cash wages.
Okay, say it was like a nice trailer, right? Like you've got like a new fifth wheel, nice. I mean, those things are like so nice nowadays. And you've already paid it off. And so now it's like, would you to determine the value of that rental, you would look at what is Joe Schmo down the street renting his trailer for? Like, how would you determine the value of that? You're like in the boonies.
Look and see, loop in a real estate professional. I mean,
Okay.
I would say bring in somebody and say, hey, I'm going to rent out my trailer. I've looked at all the laws. I've talked to my lawyer. I'm comfortable renting this out if I were a landlord and not being exposed to liability. I'm not violating any zoning laws. What could I rent this out for?
Okay. Got it. Sorry, I'll stop.
I think you're probably going to get stopped somewhere earlier in the process, though, as far as whether the trailer is going to meet your obligation as a landlord.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So let's see if Jody can get through this last part of the non-cash wages and we can make it to our break, which is at 10:30. And we're doing great, by the way. Great job, everybody. I'm glad that we're getting through this on time.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to, I had a question.
Yeah. So again, and this might be another thing that would halt your renting out a trailer in its tracks. It has to be for the primary benefit of the employee. If you're just providing this because it's convenient to you, it's not going to be for the primary benefit of the employee. The regulations that implement the FLSA have specific items listed that are determined as for the benefit of the employer, not the employee. So you can't use any of these as non-cash wages. Tools of the trade and other materials incidental to carry on your business, costs of construction by and for the employer, and costs of uniforms and laundering if you require your employees to wear uniforms. Under Colorado law, you can't require employees to pay for their uniforms if you require uniforms anyway, so this shouldn't come into effect. Or if you're violating and providing it as non-cash wages, you'd be violating Colorado state law as well. Tax implications for non-cash wages, something else you want to take into consideration. You're going to be scrutinized by the IRS if you do this. So you want to make sure you're crossing all your T's, dotting all your I's, loop in an attorney and a CPA if you need to. There are also risks for your employees. If you're using a commodity, if the price of the commodity dives after you provide it to your employee, they might end up making less. So there's a kind of a risk reward thing for your employee as well. If the IRS determines it's a cash equivalent payment, the wages would be subject to payroll taxes. Best practices here are, like I said, if you have an employment agreement, if you use non-cash wages, I definitely recommend that you have an employment agreement in place that specifies the employee's duties that are defined as agricultural labor, state that the employee will be paid a commodity wage. You want to put the type of commodity in there, the quantity of the commodity, and make sure that's signed by both the employee and the employer. One other thing is if you have an operating loan from a bank and the bank has a lien or a security interest in your crops, make sure that you understand the implications of transferring some of that crop to your employee if it's going to trigger a default or anything like that to the bank. Consider if the lien is going to be removed if you transfer it to the employee. Social Security implications. This is one that you could long-term screw your employees. You want to make sure that you're paying enough cash wages to provide for 4 full quarters of credit for the employee, so that when they're 67 years old and they're claiming Social Security, they have enough wages or enough continuous wages throughout their career to actually receive Social Security payments. Again, because of all the potential risks here and the requirement that you strictly comply with the law, I would say definitely loop in your CPA and or your attorney if you want to use non-cash wages. So any additional questions on that?
I've got one.
Sure.
The CSA farm often, I do what I call a work trade, in which a member is given a CSA share in exchange for X number of hours of helping, but I can't call it volunteering.
Mhm.
Is that considered a non-cash wage, and I should have an employment agreement with that member?
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you.
It may also depend on how much, if they're an owner in the CSA.
Well,
Yeah, if they own more than 20% of the company, there may be different wage rules that would apply as far as what you do and don't have to pay. But yeah, most CSA situations, you're looking at non-cash wages, and I would make sure we have an agreement in place.
awesome. Thanks.
Mhm. All
Okay, I
right.
have one
Oh.
more, sorry.
We'll go back to questions.
Okay, in terms of reporting all of this, if you've got an employment agreement where it's really clear, like in terms of you reporting it as in-kind wages, is that just a pretty like simple line item that you just fill in on what you're reporting? And then as the employee, am I going to see that on my tax return that I've been paid I've technically been paid $1,000 a month times 8 months, $8,000, but is that going to show up anywhere?
Yeah, so I'm not a tax attorney, so I'm not going to speak to exactly how you fill out forms or anything like that, because that's not something I do. My part of the law is boring enough. I wouldn't want to be a tax attorney. So you will remit, you'll remit your quarterly tax filings to the IRS, to the state, and you'll identify income that you paid to employees. And there will be, I believe there's some way on the form to indicate that they were non-cash wages. An employee will receive a W-2 just like any other employee, and it will identify the income that they received as non-cash wages, and the employee will have to pay income tax on that.
Okay, that's what I was asking, because I think a lot of times this comes into particular with low-wage farm workers, is that they qualify for Medicaid because their housing is free. And so it looks like they're getting paid peanuts, but they're getting paid, right? They don't have to pay rent. So and that happened to me for a long time back in the day. I was like getting technically paid like $10,000 a year, but I didn't have to buy food or housing or utilities. So that's it will show up on your tax return, and you probably will be responsible for reporting those to, say, Medicaid, right? Like you would probably.
Could be.
Right.
I would definitely say loop in your CPA when you're doing taxes.
Sure.
Sounds like, you would only get it's only if your employer reports your wages, your non-cash
Exactly.
wages, right?
Yes.
So if
Which
they
Yes.
report it on your W-2 because they didn't know they had to report it, then you're not, I mean, it's wrong, like they're doing their taxes wrong, but if they didn't report it for you, then you're not reporting
But
it.
it looks like they're not paying minimum wage.
Right.
Like,
that might be true too, but you
Because-
don't report an employee's hours necessarily on your W-2. So I don't
Yeah.
know.
You're, as an employee, you're responsible for paying income tax on all income you receive. So
Yeah.
if your employer screws it up, you could still be on the hook for paying income tax on it. If you were personally audited, then you should still be paying income tax on it, even if your employer screws up your W-2.
Okay.
So
All right. Good to
this is
know.
why you want to make sure that as an employer, you understand this. But yeah, it still is income, and you will still be responsible as an employee to pay your income tax.
I have one more question on the work share scenario. Is the valuation, like, does that go back to minimum wage when you're showing like what the non-cash wage was? Like essentially paying in vegetables for the CSA share labor?
I guess that's,
It makes sense.
say that again, I'm sorry.
Okay, so in the situation Chris Ann explained, where you have a member in your CSA program that doesn't volunteer, but works on the farm, and you give them a discount on their CSA share for the hours that they put in, do you have to show that the value of the vegetables that they're getting is some hourly equivalent in pay?
Yeah, so you'll still be required to, you'll still credit that reasonable cost of whatever you provided them against the wages that you would otherwise be required to pay. You may also take into consideration, if it meets the statutory definition of non-cash wages, the discount for their CSA membership. So you can most likely put all of that in a bucket and credit it against what you are required to pay them as wages, but you want to have records reflecting all of this and put an agreement in place. I was a little distracted because it looks like your head's like a head of lettuce coming up out of the field behind you. It is excellent. Like, that's the best background I've seen.
Well, it kind of feels to me like the CSA thing is a little bit complicated though too, because people are working for you, but you're giving them a discount on only your product, right? Like, so it's kind of like script. I don't know, like that feels sort of dangerous to me, which is a bummer because I know a lot of CSA programs that do that kind of thing.
I think there are a lot of CSAs that are really in the gray area.
So like, what if it works out that the number of hours that they put in and the discount that they get is like they're working for $2 an hour? Is that like, you absolutely can't do that anymore?
You'll just need to you'll need to supplement whatever that amount is, so you can supplement them up to minimum wage.
Okay, that's definitely going to change things.
Yeah.
And then you
That's why-
also would have to get them on a W-2, like actually put them as an employee, right?
Yep, exactly.
Right.
And that's why the new Comps Order 38 that requires minimum wage for all agricultural employees is such a change.
Wow, I don't know if it's even worth doing a work share anymore then. Okay, thank you.
It's going to change the industry.
Okay, guys, let's do a 5-minute break. Let's come back around 10:41 or thereabouts, and we'll continue with some more fun stuff like taxes. So we'll see you soon. Get some coffee, take a bathroom break.
From their call. If employees want to withhold additional amounts for state income tax, they are allowed to complete this separate Colorado withholding certificate, not required to. The main thing here, main takeaway is all employees have to have a filled out W-4 on file for withholding purposes. As an employer, you have to file the W-4s with the IRS, the Colorado Department of Revenue. My recommendation is to just always do it as soon as you get it. The regulation says promptly, but I say just get it in as quick as possible. You're required if your employees earn more than $200 a week, employee claims an exemption, and they didn't submit a Colorado withholding certificate. So either way, I say err on the side of caution, have the W-4 done on the first day of employment and submitted as soon as possible. Both federal and state law require withholding unless wages are exempt. If an employee is exempt from federal withholding, they're also generally speaking going to be exempt from state withholding. You have to apply for and maintain an active Colorado wage withholding account, which is where you'll deposit your withholdings for your Colorado state income taxes for your employees. There's a IRS publication called IRS Publication 15 that provides all the information you need to know about wage withholding for federal taxes. It's available on irs.gov. I would say look at it, learn it, love it, own it. It explains all your obligations. You're going to be required to submit quarterly tax filings and remittances of payroll taxes. One thing to keep in mind, if you screw this up and don't withhold as you're properly supposed to under the law, you're going to be liable for withholding regardless. The state requirement is going to be a little bit different than the federal requirement as far as remitting state taxes. You're going to remit on either a quarterly, monthly, or weekly basis, depending on your total annual withholding liability. If it's less than $7,000, you'll remit quarterly. $7,000 to $50,000, you'll remit monthly. And if it's more than $50,000, then you'll remit weekly. If you fail to withhold, you're also going to be subject to statutory penalties and interest. W-2s for each one of your employees. Again, we're talking employees, not independent contractors. Independent contractors receive a 1099. W-2s, you have to prepare and submit a filled out W-2 to the IRS, Colorado Department of Revenue, and the employee by January 31st of each year for the previous year's wages. They'll be subject to penalties for each W-2 that's not submitted on time. This is really scintillating stuff. I'm sorry. State law requirements. This is all mandatory stuff. So you got to learn it somewhere, right? Workers' comp insurance. All businesses in Colorado have to get workers' comp insurance if you have one or more employee, which every employer is going to have one or more employee. You can either get commercial insurance or self-insurance. There is no state-sponsored plan in Colorado. By law, Pinnacle Assurance is a private, I don't know if they're considered a quasi-state or private company, but Pinnacle Assurance is required by law to provide workers' comp insurance for all Colorado employers. So if you can't get it anywhere else, Pinnacle Assurance has to provide it for you. You can get it from other providers. As a practical matter, most employers use Pinnacle Assurance. So you can get commercial insurance from Pinnacle or anybody else. You can self-insure if you've been in business for at least 5 years, or a subsidiary of a company that's been in business for 5 years, and you have at least 300 employees in Colorado, or have a parent company that has assets of at least $100 million. So huge companies can self-insure. If any of you has a parent company with $100 million in assets, let's be friends. So workers' comp insurance, there are reporting requirements that go along with workers' comp issues. The requirements are on here. If it's a non-fatal injury, it's very technical, workers' comp. So you just want to make sure that you understand who does what, when, and what you could be liable for, or what the insurance company could be liable for. If it's a non-fatal injury, then the insurance carrier files a report of first injury, which is a FROI, with the Division of Workers' Comp within 10 days, and then has to file a position on the claim within 20 days of the FROI. If it's a fatal injury, if the employee initially survives but later succumbs to the injury, then the employer has to file the FROI on the date of death. So in that situation, you have two claims. You have the FROI by the insurance carrier, then one by the employer. if it's unclear what caused the death, the employer has to report to the insurance carrier ASAP. One thing to keep in mind, you'll want to make sure if you have an employee injury, I would just recommend contacting an attorney and making sure that you understand the reporting requirements, because they're technical. That's kind of the main takeaway from that. But the other main takeaway is that if you don't report the injuries properly or promptly, they could delay the investigation and the benefits due to the employee, or if it's a fatal injury and they're dependents of a deceased employee, those benefits could be cut or completely voided out. So you want to make sure that you do this properly so that you don't harm your employees on the back end by not getting them what they're entitled to. And then I also included the employee reporting requirement. If an employee is injured and they have an injury that allows them to recover under workers' comp, then they have to report that injury within 4 days to the employer. They can also report it to the Division of Workers' Compensation. And workers' compensation is funny. The statutes are really detailed. They provide, specifically what an employee is entitled to. If they lose a finger at this digit, then they're entitled to this much money. If they lose it at this digit, they're entitled to this much money. It's really like that granular. So I would say if you have a workplace injury issue and workers' comp could be implicated, just loop in an attorney and make sure you have the reporting aspect taken care of and you understand what you need to do. Unemployment insurance, every employer, going back to workers' comp, the main thing you need to know at the beginning is you need to get a workers' comp policy. So that's kind of the main takeaway from that. And if you have an issue, contact an attorney. Unemployment insurance, you're required in Colorado to open an account with the Department of Unemployment Insurance. So unlike workers' comp, this is run by the state. There's the Division of Unemployment Insurance within the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. You will pay quarterly premiums for your unemployment insurance account, submit quarterly wage reports, and then benefits are paid out to employees if they have qualifying unemployment. And in Colorado, the standard is you can get unemployment insurance if you're unemployed through no fault of your own. So layoffs, things like that. So you'll have an account with the Division of Unemployment Insurance. If you have a former employee who makes a claim, they'll be paid out of that account. If you don't have enough money in your account to pay all of the employees' claims, there's a general pool that the state maintains that will cover any additional amounts. Do note that if you do have claims against your unemployment insurance account, your premiums could go up the next year.
Jody, we have a question from Chrisanne asking, so if you are an LLC partnership and the only people who are working are owners, or if you're just like the only employee on your own farm, you don't have to get workers' comp, correct? Or can you? I've also heard you can't get workers' comp.
If you only have owner.
If you're the only one working on your own farm, or you and your partner.
You wouldn't be considered a W-2 employee.
So I'm not an employee. I'm not employing myself. So I'm not an employee. I don't need workers' comp.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you.
Because I think originally workers' comp was created to protect the employer, correct?
Yeah, it was this grand bargain back in the day when they came up with these workers' comp laws where employers there'd be a limit on what they'd have to pay. They wouldn't be liable. So if you have an employee who gets injured on your property, workers' comp is their exclusive, or gets injured during working hours and the injury is related to their employment, their exclusive remedy is workers' comp. So they can't then also sue you for negligence or something like that. If it's an intentional action, like you can't go punch your employee in the face and expect not to be sued. But if it's an injury that's arising out of their job duties, their exclusive remedy is workers' comp. So that protects employers from negligence types of lawsuits, premises liability types of lawsuits, things like that. But it also provides a guaranteed way for employees to recover if they're injured on the job. So it's kind of a bargain, both sides benefit.
Yeah, it makes it a little easier to swallow when you realize how much you get protected as much as the employee.
Yeah. So new hire reporting is one of the other state law requirements that you need to know about right off the bat. Go to the Colorado New Hire Reporting Center online, create an account, and essentially every time you hire somebody, you need to report that employee to the state within 20 days of hire. And that's all you need to do there. So I'm going to jump into best employment practice. How long are we going till on this section, Helen?
Got until about 11:30.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I know.
Can
All
I
right.
ask a quick question about the unemployment insurance?
Sure.
Maybe this is changed since the comp order 38, but in the greenhouse industry, when we hired seasonal employees, I was under the understanding or under the impression that we didn't have to pay unemployment insurance because we could let them go at any time because they were seasonal. Is that not a thing anymore, or was that never a thing and I just misunderstood?
I'll need to look into that. My understanding is that every employer who employs employees, and that would include seasonal, needs to open an unemployment insurance account with the state and pay premiums. I don't believe there's an exception for nurseries or greenhouses with seasonal employees. They may not work there long enough to qualify for unemployment insurance. So, there's a certain, when they apply for unemployment insurance, the Division of Unemployment Insurance will look at what they call a base period, which I think is the previous 5 quarters of work, 4 of the previous 5 quarters of work or something like that. And the only employers who will have to pay is if you're a qualifying base period employer, and there are requirements that go along with that. So you may not ever be on the hook for those seasonal workers, but I believe you still have to have an account with the Division of Unemployment Insurance and pay premiums.
Okay.
Pretty
I thought
sure
that's
that's true.
I just thought it
Sorry,
was
Shannon.
ad workers in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so when I've applied for unemployment from an ag worker, from an agricultural employer, like there's some section about it where you have to say if you're a seasonal worker or not, because you can have sort of this set employment period, which is the season, right? And so there's some stuff around, I don't know what it is exactly, but there's some stuff around the end of that season, and whether or not that means that you're actually unemployed or that you've just finished sort of the period of your employment. I don't know. Yeah, we should find out.
Yeah, so the wages that they have to meet a statutory requirement to be considered qualifying wages that were paid during the base period to the employee. And there are time limits associated with that. This isn't a main area of my practice. I don't know the time periods off the top of my head, but it may very well be that the employees didn't work there long enough to receive any qualifying wages under the statute. But I don't think that changes the requirement that you open an account with the Division of Unemployment Insurance. But I can look into that, and I'll do that when the other presentations are going on.
Yeah, I had someone file for unemployment for the first time ever. Like, we've been in business for 13 years or something. We never had to deal with this until a couple months ago. And so I was going through it with the unemployment insurance office, and they had similar thresholds to that highly seasonal workplace that you were talking about before. I forget which section that was. But they were asking me, how many employees do you have at your peak season versus, year round? And so there were some exemptions there if we were considered a highly seasonal workplace.
Okay, yeah, I'll take a look at that, and I'll see what I can find here on the break.
Thanks, Jody. We
I-
have one more basic question for
Sure.
you that we should answer. Mary Lou asks, I've never heard of this law that you must let the state know when you hire a new employee. Can you explain that? To whom do you report the new employee?
Yeah, so It's I think it's a division within the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment called the New Hire Division. I'm not sure 100% that that's the name of it. I know that their online portal is called the Colorado New Hire Reporting Center, and by statute, by Colorado statute, every employer is required to report employees to the state, and it's just a kind of a black and white requirement. The reasoning behind it has to do with protecting against child labor and all sorts of terrible things that could go on in an exploitative workplace. But that's essentially the requirement, is you just have to make sure that you're reporting your employees. Okay, I'm just making a note to myself real quick. Okay, so let's jump into this best employment practices section real quick. Job descriptions, these are extremely important now in light of a new Colorado law called the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, which we will jump into here a little bit later. But best employment practices, make sure you have job descriptions in place for each job. This could be extremely important if you rely on immigrant labor and you ever want to sponsor an employee for a visa, you'll need to have that job description in place. So there are advertising requirements, things like that, to try and find, I don't know off the top of my head what the temporal requirement is for advertising, but you do have to advertise for the position, including the job description, things like that, before you'd be allowed to sponsor an employee for a visa. That's one of the pieces early on. Also recommend that all employers have a handbook and that it's up to date. Labor and employment law changes frequently, and it's a very political beast. Depending on which political party is in power, the laws swing back and forth to be either more employer friendly or more employee friendly. So if you have a handbook, which I definitely recommend, you're going to want to make sure that you review it every year or two, distribute to employees on an annual basis. If you're ever in front of the EEOC or the Colorado Civil Rights Division, the NLRB, any of these employment agencies, the first thing they'll ask for as sort of a representation of how your workplace operates is your handbook. It's going to be Exhibit 1 in any sort of complaint against you. So get one in place. If you don't have one in place, then you're going to be subject to negative inferences from employing agencies, as well as, God forbid you ever have to go before a jury in a trial. So we're going to talk a little bit about these issues: discipline, performance evaluations, termination, and just sort of some general thoughts about it. There are a million different best employment practices that we could talk about, but these are some of the more important ones I thought I'd include here. Sort of fundamental, elemental type of issues. Discipline, nobody ever wants to talk about discipline or get involved in discipline. You don't hire employees to discipline them. You want them to do well, but it is an aspect of employing individuals, is that at some point somebody's going to do something wrong and you're going to have to confront how to discipline them. We recommend having a progressive discipline policy in place. There are benefits to it if it's done correctly. As a private employer, you're not required without some sort of contractual obligation to provide employees with formal due process when you impose discipline, but fairness is a primary consideration for juries and judges, administrative agencies, if they're ever evaluating legal claims brought by disgruntled employees. And it shows reasonableness on the part of the employer and a sort of respect for employees. If you do it improperly, or if you execute your discipline policy poorly, you could be bound to conduct you wouldn't have otherwise instituted. It could damage your credibility if a lawsuit ever arose, or if you're before an employment agency and you're not applying your discipline policy consistently. You could have a demoralized workforce because rules are not followed by managers and supervisors. You could have confused managers, supervisors, employees because of insufficient guidance. So these are things you want to put in place. You want to make sure that you're doing them correctly. When you're drafting a policy, you want to make sure that it fits your company culture and needs, and that it matches your actual practice. This is important. My guidance to employers is, why have a policy if it's not going to mirror what actually happens on the ground? So make sure that you're crafting a policy that matches what you do. In the policy, you're going to want to provide contact information for the employer, for an employer representative who can answer questions about the policy. Employees can't follow rules that they don't understand. You want to keep it simple, avoid excessive detail. Too many details and too many issues. Too many details will create issues for argument if there's a disciplinary meeting. If you keep the language of the policy simple, it allows you to exercise discretion. You want to make sure it's accessible for the employees. You want to be able to demonstrate receipt and acknowledgement of the policy. So, having a handbook that employees sign and return to you, or return the acknowledgement page, is one way to do that. You want to consider distributing the policies either online or in hand, probably on an annual or every 2 years kind of a basis. And you want to keep your policies professional. If you have an unprofessional tone in your policies, they might not be taken seriously by employees. It may also cause you, if you're defending those policies before an agency or a judge or a jury, you could lose credibility. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that they're current. So keeping the policy updated to reflect changes in federal and state laws is important. Included a policy example here across these next 2 slides. This is just a really generic discipline policy that you could drop in a handbook, with possibly tailoring it to meet your circumstances. This is generally what you're looking at when you're looking at progressive discipline: verbal warning, written warning, some sort of probation or administrative leave, and then termination. You do want to leave yourself discretion, though, to jump around between these different steps as the situation warrants. But generally speaking, you want to have sort of a consistent policy that you follow, consistent steps. You want to make sure that you're following, when you're applying these policies, you want to make sure you're following your rules. In addition to policies, your past practices will also be evaluated in employment lawsuits or agency actions. Ensuring compliance with your policies shows that your practices are consistent with those policies, which makes any sort of potential lawsuit or complaint against you easier to defend. Whenever you're doling out discipline, make sure you understand the context. Look at whether the employee has been disciplined before. Was the employee informed about the policies and procedures? Again, the signed acknowledgement of the receipt of handbook is important. Look at whether what you discipline the employee about, whether it was approved by a manager or supervisor. You want to be consistent. As I mentioned earlier, employees have a reasonable expectation to know what the consequences of their actions will be. You also want to reduce the risk of a potential discrimination claim. If you're doling out discipline differently amongst employees, they might key on, well, this person was disciplined this way and he's a 33-year-old white male, and this person was disciplined this way and she's a 42-year-old Hispanic female. So, you're opening yourself up to some sorts of discrimination claims if you are not applying it consistently. The elements of a prima facie claim of discrimination is that you have similarly situated individuals, so people doing similar jobs. When you have somebody outside of your protected class who's treated more favorably than you were, and that's essentially all you need for a prima facie claim. The employer has a chance to rebut those prima facie claims if you're ever before an agency or in court, but it doesn't take much to allege a claim of discrimination that will prompt agency action. So consistency is key. If any sort of discretion that you're exercising with regards to treating employees differently has to be based on legitimate business and legal reasons. Otherwise, there's a risk for a claim of discrimination or retaliation. If you have supervisors or managers, make sure you're training them on your policies and use consistent language when you're describing similar employee performance and other problems. One of the other issues I see with employers who are doling out discipline is that they don't do it promptly. Imposing discipline shortly after the act, for one, it'll help you correct workplace problems more efficiently, but two, it'll also strengthen your legal defense if the discipline leads to litigation, because the longer it takes to discipline somebody, the stronger an employee's argument will be that the discipline was pretext for discrimination. So when you're when you're disciplining employees, you want to be specific, avoid generalizations, avoid general language in any sort of written discipline. The more specific you are, the easier it is to tie it to a legitimate business or legal reason if litigation ever results. And it should go without saying, but don't retaliate against your employees. Federal and state law prohibit employers from taking adverse employment actions against employees who participate in legally protected conduct. So if it's questionable as to whether conduct is legally protected, contact legal counsel. And the key that I drive home with all my clients is document, document, document. That's your best defense with any to any sort of claim of discrimination or retaliation, is you want to make sure that you're documenting all these steps. And having a standardized discipline form that is consistently used in disciplinary situations is important. So I've included example corrective action forms on the next couple of slides, front side and back side. Just an easy way to sort of fill in the blanks and make sure you're covering your documentation bases.
Hey, Jody, I
Yeah.
just have a real basic question again, which is, could you just explain quickly what at-will employment means in our
Sure.
context in this state?
Yeah, at-will employment means either the employee or the employer can terminate the employment relationship for any reason or no reason at all, other than a reason that's prohibited by the law. And what we're looking at is discrimination, retaliation, things like that. All of the, 49 of the 50 states, Montana's the outlier, are at-will employment states. Colorado is kind of a quasi at-will employment. It is technically an at-will employment state, but we have this statute called the Lawful Off-Duty Activity Statute that provides protections to employees for engaging in lawful off-duty activities. You can't terminate an employee for, participating in something you don't like him or her doing while they're off duty. So that provides an extra layer of protection that typical at-will employment wouldn't. So you want to make sure that you're careful if you're disciplining an employee for something they did off duty. With that said, if the employee is, gets a DUI or something, and you want to terminate them for that, you can do that. That wouldn't be protected by the Lawful Off-Duty Activity Statute because DUIs aren't lawful. Drunk driving isn't lawful. So yeah, that's what at-will employment is. If you're going to terminate, you can do it anytime you want. If you have an employment contract, that may alter the at-will status of the relationship. That may provide additional rights to the employee in their job, but generally speaking, without a contract, if the employee is not in a union with a collective bargaining agreement in place, they're going to be considered an at-will employee, and you can terminate for any reason or no reason, as long as it's not discriminatory or retaliatory. So disciplining employee, just application, things you want to keep in mind if you're going to discipline an employee and they make a workplace complaint, because that's when you're typically going to run into situations where they're alleging retaliation. If the employee makes a protected workplace complaint, they're complaining about, my manager harassed me, or complaining about wages or something like that, and then you discipline or terminate them within the next week or two, you're kind of setting yourself up for a retaliation complaint. So when that happens, if there's a complaint on file that's close in time to the discipline or termination, step back, evaluate, discuss. Is the reason for the discipline, hold on, did the employee actually engage in the conduct that is causing discipline to be meted out? What do you have documentation that the reason for the discipline was occurring before the complaint? And then what is the discipline? So if it's in most situations, you'll have a good feeling as far as whether this employee is going to be the kind of employee who's going to go to the EEOC and make a claim for retaliation or something like that. If it's close, you may want to loop in legal counsel and discuss it, just so you kind of know what your potential exposure is to risk if you move forward with discipline after an employee complaint. But in that situation, you want to make sure that you evaluate all of the facts in the situation and you understand what potential risks are out there if you move forward with the discipline. So discipline whatever you want, but if there's a complaint, you want to make sure there's a legitimate business or factual justification for the discipline. But if there's a complaint that's close in time to the discipline, tap the brakes and just make sure you're evaluating the whole situation. Employee evaluations, and these are your annual evaluations or semi-annual, whatever you're doing. Not all employers do these. You're not required to do these by law, but I think there are benefits to it, especially if you run into problems down the road where there are allegations of discrimination or retaliation. You find yourself before an employment agency and you have to justify why you did something. If you have a history of employee evaluations on file, that will make it a lot easier to assert your defense. But if you do it correctly, the point of these are to improve work performance, efficiency, productivity, fairness, and it actually can also help increase employee attitudes by letting the employees know that you care about them, that they're part of the organization, and that they're engaged in their work, and you listen to what the feedback is during the evaluation. So there are benefits to doing these that are practical and business related, as opposed to just potential CYA for legal issues down the road. You can also get information about supervisors and the organization during these types of evaluations. Some mistakes I see from employers who do evaluations is not doing them on a regular basis, not doing them on an objective basis, including subjective language in the evaluation, being ambiguous or inaccurate. If an employee is not doing their job well, you don't want to give them a 5 out of 5 star review. So be truthful, be accurate, be regular with your evaluations, and these are a benefit for employers as well as employees. Like I mentioned, you want to make sure they're objective and specific. Evaluate the person or the performance, not the person. Consistency is key. Face-to-face evaluations help facilitate those kind of conversations with your employees where you're gaining information about your organization that you might not otherwise gain. And make sure that your employees know that they're heard and you understand their issues. This can be sort of a time for them to check in with them and see how they're doing with their job, and make sure that they're on the right track and you're all on the same page. As I mentioned, if you're not going to be accurate with the performance evaluation, might as well not do it at all. If an employee down the road files a claim against you with an employment agency for discrimination, you say, no, wait, the reason we did this is because they're a terrible employee, and you pull out 5 years of glowing employee evaluations, it's going to be a hard one to justify. So be accurate. Evaluation inflation is a real thing. Not everybody's a rock star. We're all adequate. Most of us are adequate, and we have to learn how to deal with that. So don't be afraid of hurting your employees' feelings. Call a spade a spade. Terminations, again, not something that most employers want to have to think about, but it's something that most employers will face at some point or another. I have some quick tips here. I recommend doing them face-to-face. Just like breaking up with a girlfriend, you don't want to do it over text. Have a witness there, typically somebody else who's in management or HR, more as an extra set of eyes and ears so that you can focus on delivering the message. And you'll have somebody else there to witness what was said in case it's ever disputed or you need to establish what happened. Tell the person that the company has decided to end his or her employment. Believe it or not, I've had plenty of clients who come to me who tried to terminate somebody, and then they show up to work and it's because they weren't clear in the meeting that the employment is ended. So make it clear that the employment is ended. If they request a reason, be honest with them and give them a chance to say their piece. You want to be objective and professional. Don't apologize for the actions of the company. This is the decision the company made. There's a legitimate business justification for it. You don't need to apologize. The apologies in these types of meetings can be construed differently if there are ever claims of discrimination or wrongful termination or something like that. So, and it minimizes embarrassment for everybody involved. You want to provide information about benefits, the last paycheck, any severance that you're offering. If you do offer severance, make sure you get a release of claims. That's kind of the purpose of severance in most situations, is you're providing that so that you can rest assured that they aren't going to come back and sue you down the road. Coordinate return of company properly. In that termination meeting, you want to listen closely for claims of discrimination, mistreatment, legal threats, things like that. If circumstances dictate, you may want to include a termination letter just so that there's evidence of a written decision. And then document what was said in the meeting, prepare a memo, put it in the employee's personnel file. Do note that in Colorado, we have a law that was passed a few years ago. Employees do have a right to access their personnel file. And that includes even after their employment has ended, they can come back at least once and review their personnel file. So document what was said, draft a memo, make sure it's objective, and put it in the personnel file. I did include a checklist that I think Helen sent out to you. It's just sort of a checklist I've developed over the years to help employers as they're going through this process, because it's one of the most frequent calls I get from my clients is, I want to fire this guy. I want to make sure he doesn't come back and sue me. What do I need to do? So I've kind of created a laundry list of items to check off, go through the personnel file, make sure it has this, this, and this, make sure it doesn't have anything in there you don't want the employee to see. It has tips for the meeting, return of company property, all that sort of stuff. So feel free to use that if you ever find yourself in the situation down the road, and feel free to reach out to me if you ever have any questions or want to talk about it. So The Office was an excellent show that ran for 8 years, one of my favorites. And it basically presented every single employment scenario and the wrong way to respond. But most of this employment advice comes down to Dwight Schrute's thoughts on the issue. So,
what's the most inspiring thing I ever said to you? Don't be an idiot. Changed my life. Whenever I'm about to do something, I think, would an idiot do that? And if they would, I do not do that thing.
So, a lot of this does boil down to common sense and not being an idiot. We see examples of people in positions of power all the time in their workplaces making idiotic comments that just, make my skin crawl. This is from NFL and college football world. Lane Kiffin, who's the football coach for the University of Mississippi. This was one of his comments that he made about one of his assistant coaches. He's got a beautiful wife. How'd Charlie get her? I look at assistant coaches' wives. It tells me if they're a good recruiter or not. And that actually came from another coach, Penn State's James Franklin, who said essentially the same thing. So, just examples of idiocy on display. These quotes could come back and haunt Lane Kiffin or James Franklin if they ever had a female employee come to them and claim they were sexually harassed or discriminated against, or if, say, an LGBT assistant coach didn't get a job for one of these guys and claimed that he didn't get the job because he didn't have, nor would he ever have, a beautiful wife. State and federal law protects sexual orientation in the workplace. Just be careful what you're saying with employees. Another idiotic quote. This has to do with Darius Juice, who was a football player, who went through the NFL combine process a few years ago. And he was describing his experience meeting with these NFL teams, his future prospective employers, where he said he goes in one room and a team asks him if he likes men just to see his reaction. He goes in another room that try to bring up pictures of his family or bring up one of my family members or something and tells me, hey, I heard your mom sells herself. How do you feel about that? These are clear no-nos. Use your common sense. We all have it. Think about Dwight Schrute. If an idiot would do something, do not do that thing. If a thought pops into your head that makes you pause and think about whether or not you should say it in a workplace, err on the side of caution and just enjoy the thought internally. Applying Dwight Schrute's words of wisdom, act with respect when you're dealing with your employees. Gather information first before you make decisions. Don't prejudge a situation. Engage all of the stakeholders who are involved in the circumstances. Think first, act second. don't act alone, bring in other people and bounce your crazy thoughts off of somebody before you go to your employees. Don't act on emotion, don't act in a vacuum, be consistent and seek input, whether that be from managers, supervisors, the board of directors, legal counsel, etc. So I think we ended this section a little bit early, but that opens it up for questions.
Yeah, we're gonna take a little break here in about 2 minutes. So if anybody has any, or just thoughts, if you guys have any thoughts about like how you've been evaluated in the past, or how you would sort of take these lessons that Jody's giving us and sort of apply them to a smaller employment situation. I think just for me, some thoughts that came up were just that, I mean, maybe I don't have, like, I have a part-time employee this past year, right? I had her for 10 hours a week. So that was all my help that I had, right? And so I'm thinking, like, how do I incorporate a little bit of employee review with her, just so that I'm sort of protected. And also, I think, a lot of this has to do with just avoiding being sued, right? And so that's like, how can we create good relationships with our employees and our employers so that, nobody wants to sue each other. And I think that having those conversations like employee reviews, whether or not you want to call it that, maybe it's just you're having a check-in with them every month or so. That's just like Jody's been saying and presenting is a good practice, a good best practice.
I would say that there's more risk. There's probably more risk, as far as in my experience, with small employers, because there's a lot more that's just done informally. And there's not the documentation of monthly check-ins, or you're generally closer to your coworkers and employees in these smaller situations, especially like in the ag setting where you're out in the field working together and stuff like that. Just remember that it is a workplace, and issues could come up, and you will want to make sure that you have treated it like a workplace at that point. Just the last couple slides, inappropriate workplace conduct. I think that there's potentially a higher risk for that in small employers too, because there's a lot more, like I said, you're closer with them. There's a lot more joking, I think, back and forth, and it's just easier to cross that line because it's not quite such a big professional organization. So just keep in mind that even as a small employer, you are subject to a lot of these same risks.
Yeah, I think something else that I've also tried to think about is like this person working on your farm, especially if they're new to farming, like this is such a huge life change for them. And they're like probably dealing with like moving to another place, like settling in. They don't have a lot of friends yet, like still figuring out. And even if they have worked for a while, they're probably figuring out like, do I even want to do this anymore? I don't know. I feel like agricultural internships, like the ones that we host at a lot of our farms, are very like vulnerable times for the people. So it's like, and I think a lot of my mentors in the past have shown me a lot of mercy, and I would like to, pass that on, because it is really, sometimes we're not acting in our reasonable brain when we're put in uncomfortable situations. And so, yeah, I would say that it's hard sometimes when you've been in the industry for so long to think about being like that again, but that is the case for a lot of people that we're hiring.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like just having that, it comes back to like having the beginner's mind, right? So remembering what it's like to do that farm work for the first time.
Yes, it takes them 5 times. Like studies show, at least on ranches, it takes an employee in the first year 5 times longer than their employer. And so getting frustrated at that and like having a lot of grace, I think, is really important. And then having structures that protect you when that person gets really grumpy, like I think that's super important.
Awesome.
Yeah. I will say, most of the discrimination, retaliation types of claims or charges that I see, that there was at some point a good relationship between the employer and the employee, or the manager, supervisor, and the employee. And then something happens and the employee suddenly has an axe to grind or gets grumpy and files a claim. And then looking back at the previous couple of years of conduct, looks completely differently when the parties are at loggerheads and don't want to deal with each other. The jokes that you told in the workplace, a year ago, they're not as funny when you're reading them on a transcript before an EEOC investigator. So just keep that in mind. Everything's good until it's not, and then it goes south real quick.
Yeah. Okay, guys, well, let's go ahead and take a break here until, and if you have any more questions, please do throw them in the chat, and we'll try and get to those after we have our presentation from Jennifer Benson, who's with the Department of Ag. And then we've got Eric Yoe from, I actually don't know how to say his last name, hopefully he'll help us, from the Department of Labor and Employment on the new ag worker rules. So we're gonna have about another hour from that, and then we'll wrap up with some additional considerations at the end. So we'll see you back here around 11:35. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions, and to Jody for your presentations.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen here.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, we're going to get started again. Our next presentation is from Jennifer Benson, and she is the grants specialist at the Colorado Department of Ag. And she's here to talk about the Agricultural Workforce Development Program and any other opportunities for funding for employees. I'll pass it over to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. And hello, everyone. Good morning and good to be with you. I recognize some familiar faces and names on the list, so that's exciting to see you all. Just by way of quick introduction, my name's Jennifer Benson, and I am a grant specialist at the Department of Agriculture. I use she, her pronouns. Just as far as background, I grew up in a conventional farming family in Missouri, so agriculture in a way is sort of in my blood. I moved to Colorado in 2015 to attend the University of Colorado Law School in Boulder and studied food and ag law and policy there, and actually had the opportunity while I was in school to intern with National Young Farmers Coalition. So I spent a semester really as the Ag Workforce Development Program was just a concept or idea, kind of putting together some plans for that. And then I ended up becoming staff at the Young Farmers as Western Campaigns Director in 2018 as this program was really being launched. So I have, it sort of is like my baby that I've watched grow up and now oversee as a grant specialist at the department. So it's a very special program to me and really excited to share it with you today. I see some previous recipients of Ag Workforce grants on the call, so feel free if I miss anything or if you have anything to add to jump in as I go through the presentation. So just a little bit of background. I shared a little bit with my background, but for the program, like I mentioned in 2017 and then the 2018 legislative sessions, Colorado General Assembly session, there was actually a Young and Beginning Farmer Interim Study Committee that was a group of state representatives and state senators who formed a committee specifically to talk about young and beginning farmer issues. And that was really unique to Colorado and the result of some advocacy efforts that the National Young Farmers Coalition took on. So because we had that special committee formed specifically on that topic, this bill that ended up becoming Senate Bill 1842 that created the Ag Workforce Development Program came out of that committee with a ton of support. So just another example of how your advocacy efforts really matter and make a difference. So the bill was passed in 2018, and then the department took on a stakeholder engagement effort where, had public hearings, formed a group of organizations, ag organizations, who informed the rules that would govern the program. I participated in on that committee as staff at Young Farmers, and drafted the first set of rules that would oversee the program. So The program went into, or I guess launched in 2019, and we hosted our first round of interns in 2019, and found a couple of things in the rules that just didn't quite work for producers who were participating. So we actually went through a second rulemaking in 2020 to tweak some of those rules and make them more, more user-friendly, I guess. And so we're now operating under those new rules in our fourth year in 2022 of the Ag Workforce Development Program. And another exciting development recently is that we've seen these programs, while Colorado, it was one of a kind in 2018, and Colorado was the first state to create something like this, at least on a statewide level. We've seen other states follow suit. So New Mexico, Arizona, and Louisiana that I know of all have programs modeled after ours now. So again, your advocacy efforts work. You're making a difference, not beyond Colorado even. So a little bit about what the program is. In its essence, it provides a financial incentive to Colorado agricultural businesses to hire an intern and provide hands-on training. So we know, whether you're even just thinking about you may be interested in ag as a career or really seeking out your first opportunity, it's really important that you have hands-on experience on the farm or ranch to figure out whether this is something you want to do or not. And those opportunities were really limited before this program existed. So that's the purpose of the program. Sorry, I have sirens outside the window. And the way that it works is a business applies to us for funding. If awarded funding, they'll hire an intern. They will host that intern for the season, and then they can reimburse or request reimbursement from the department for up to 50% of the costs of hosting that intern. So that can include wages, things like uniforms, boots, tools, workman's comp insurance, things like that, really any expenses, and including a little bit for just the overhead of overseeing an intern takes some time. So there's a little bit built in for that as well. And there is a cap in the regulation at $5,000. So, you can request up to 50% of the costs up to $5,000 at the end of the internship. The application period for this program is typically in the fall, somewhere between October and December for internships that will happen the following year. So for 2022 internships, that application period has unfortunately closed, but you can look out this coming fall for 2023 internship funding. And then just for some reference, to run this program, we receive about a $64,000 appropriation from the State General Assembly. And you can imagine that doesn't go very far when we're talking about $5,000 internships, plus just the little bit that we take for admin on, for us to run the program. 64,000 doesn't go very far. We've seen these other states with $1 million appropriations, and one day maybe we can, increase this. But because our commissioner is so passionate about this program and these efforts, she has, found us some funding in the department to supplement. So we're actually working with more like 120,000, almost double that for 2022 internships. So we hope to see that funding increase so that we can continue to spread this good work. Just as far as some statistics on the program so far. So because of that limited appropriation, or I guess maybe despite that limited appropriation, we've still been able to fund 50 internships at 28 different businesses over the past 3 years. And the reason that business number is so much lower than the internship number is we see businesses coming back year after year. So, that shows to us that it is a program that people find beneficial because they're applying year after year. And, we see a business host an intern 1 year and they've really kind of refined their program and have a really quality training that they're providing to an intern when they've been able to do that year after year. This year we received the highest number of applications we've ever received, which was 63 applications. We are planning to award 27 internships. And if you are on this call and have an application in, that announcement will be coming very soon. Before the end of the month. They're just waiting the commissioner's approval. But 27 is by far the most we've been able to award in a year. So that's very exciting. A stat I'm very excited about is in those 63 applications we received for 2022 internships, 55% of those came from woman or BIPOC owned businesses in Colorado. And then on the intern side, we do an exit survey that interns take just to report on how the program worked for them. And we get, so far over the last 3 years, we've received 93% of interns who participate and complete the exit survey report that they intend to pursue an ag career. So, by that, it appears that the program might be working, that we are creating future farmers and ranchers in Colorado. So how can you participate? Like I mentioned, applications are in the fall. So if you are interested in hosting an intern in 2023, just keep an eye out for that application, probably sometime in October or November. Erin Foster West at Young Farmers always gets this information and will share it out. So make sure you're on the proper mailing lists. And you can also sign up to be on our CDA mailing list to get it directly. The way that the application works, we try to keep it as simple as we can. We don't expect you to be a professional grant writer in order to get this funding. So it's really a pretty basic, describe your business, give us a little bit about what the internship will look like. So what will your intern expect to learn, kind of the learning objectives, and then a simple budget, how you'll allocate those $5,000. Those applications then go through a competitive review process, which we just wrapped up last week. And then we'll send out award notices. You'll have a brief contract with the department, and then you'll host your internship really with little to no interference from us. We're always available for questions. I like to conduct site visits annually if I can, just to get out and see how things are going. But otherwise, you'll submit reimbursement requests to the department and get and fill out that exit survey so we can make sure we're always improving the program. And then on the intern side, we're less involved at the department on recruiting interns. So it's really on the business to recruit their own. But we do want to make sure that we're making the program accessible to those who maybe are interested in working on a farm or ranch for a season, but don't have any connections to a farm or ranch. So this year, very simply, we're just going to post a list of the businesses who received funding and agree to be published on the website so that a potential intern could go and see this business is in my area and they have internship funds, and then they can reach out on their own. So if you're interested in interning, keep an eye out for that list coming. And that's really all I have on the Ag Workforce Program. If you don't already, do go and follow CDA on whatever your preferred social media platform is, if you have one, or on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and any grant opportunity that comes up will be published there. So that's a really easy way to keep up. We also have a grants page on the CDA website where we keep up to date with any grant opportunities. I'll mention just a couple that are available right now. So we have the Farm to Market Infrastructure Grant that has an application window open right now. I know that Colorado Proud is going to have some marketing funding available coming up soon. There's also a brand new Beginning Farmers Loan Program that is in the works. We've just hired the person who will oversee that program, and they are kind of getting the frame of that program put together. So again, Erin Foster West will share that information with you when it's available, but you can also keep an eye on CDA's social media and website. And then I'm actually going to be overseeing a new grant opportunity that doesn't even have a name yet, but is focused around ag leadership. So that fund is where we're finding the additional funding for the Ag Workforce Program, but we wanted to make sure we're offering opportunities for other ag leadership opportunities. So we're putting together a grant program. It is completely in the concept phase right now. So it would be wonderful to get any feedback from you folks if you have thoughts on how the department could better support you in your ag leadership. So let me know, but information on that will be coming soon. And then just as a final word, and then I'll open it up for questions. If you ever have questions on really anything going on at the department and don't know who to contact, feel free to reach out to me. I don't have my hand in nearly everything going on, but I can probably point you in the right direction. So, copy my email address here and feel free to reach out if you have questions on really anything going on at the department or that should be going on at the department. So that's all I have. I'll open it up. If anyone on the call who has participated in the Ag Workforce Program before has anything to add, please feel free.
I just want to read a question. Taylor helped out answering this in the chat, but Mary Lou asked, is there a minimum or maximum how much we pay the intern? Minimum wage for sure, but upper limit?
There is no upper limit. There is a minimum wage is a requirement, but otherwise we've had businesses pay their employees anywhere from $15 to $25 an hour. So it's up to you.
Great. And then Taylor just clarified that you just can't apply for more than 50% of the total cost or more than $5,000.
Correct. Yep. So if the total costs go over $10,000, the max is $5,000. If you have a $7,000 internship, then the max would be $3,500.
Okay.
Yep.
And just because we had a long discussion about internship law with our previous presenter, Jody Duvall, I'm curious how the department defines an intern. Do they have to be associated with an educational institution? Or what is, do we have obligations to do educational programming with them? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. And we don't have a legal definition, at least that I know of intern in the state, but it is defined in the regulation of the Ag Workforce Program. And it's defined very broadly, deliberately broadly. So an intern in the definition in the regulation is a student or a beginning farmer or rancher. So it's basically anyone, whether they're enrolled in a program or not, who has farmed fewer than 10 years, which follows the USDA definition of young farmer. And there is, there's an expectation that there is a learning experience being provided, but there's no requirement for any sort of formal curriculum or educational objectives. We do ask in the application for you to line out what you expect an intern to learn, but that may just be hands-on learning day to day what what it is like to work on a farm.
Great. And then we just got another question in the chat here from Chris Ann, who asks, in the previous presentation, we talked a lot about non-cash wages or value of, things that are given to employees like food or housing. So can the value of reimbursement include that cost of non-cash wages?
So there is the regulation allows for housing costs to be reimbursed. Just, with that $5,000 cap, it means it doesn't go very far. But we have had folks request reimbursements for, a portion of housing costs. For meals, I would need to look and see, and the regulation is posted on our website. I would need to confirm. I don't believe that meals are something that we've reimbursed in the past, but, again, the regulation will outline that, and I can certainly get you a yes or no answer on that.
Yeah, it seems like mainly, we'd be reimbursed for actual cash wages. So.
Right. And I mean, that almost eats up the $5,000, by the end of it.
Right. And I just want to say I did apply this year, and it was a very easy application, which I really appreciated. It's just nice to not have to write a novel when I'm also trying to hire somebody and run my farm. So we appreciate that about the ease of application.
Glad to hear that. It's an ongoing struggle with survey software to use. So Microsoft or Google has its limitations. So we get issues with get questions about putting your budget in a box. How does that work? Always working on improving that. But if anyone has suggestions on how to make the application more accessible, please share those. But glad to hear that it's pretty simple and straightforward. That's the goal.
I was just going to say really quick, we've participated in the program since it was implemented and really appreciate that it's available. And another thing you can get reimbursed for in addition to the wages is there's like some overhead stuff, like a percentage of your workers' comp and a percentage of, kind of all the other things associated with personnel. So that is helpful. You do have to heavily document all of it. The application is really easy. The reporting takes a bit of time, but not to dissuade anyone, just saying. So yeah, and then, the last thing I wanted to say was the funding, we have used the funding for positions that we actually call an apprentice. So you don't have to stick to necessarily the terminology of intern. It's just like Jennifer said, the intent is that it's someone in a learning position at your farm. So hi, Jennifer, thanks for being here.
Hi, Meg. Yeah, thank you for all of that. I'm glad you mentioned the reimbursement process, because that's also always sort of a thorn in everyone's side, but I suppose a necessary evil that we do. When reimbursements are requested, we ask that you document expenses that you're asking for reimbursements for. And that can be for payroll. Some people are just, printing out from whatever payroll software they're using, or some are sending copies of pay stubs, whatever works best for you. But we do, any purchases you're making, we do ask for receipts. But then there is, as Meg mentioned, a 10% overhead. So when you calculate all your expenses, you can also add on a 10% for overhead, and you don't need to document what that is. That's just sort of, we understand that there are costs associated with hosting someone. But yeah, thanks, Meg.
Well, awesome. If nobody has further questions about that, I'd love to hear more about the leadership opportunity or funding, and kind of what does that mean, and what's leadership? Tell us more about that.
All great questions that we are attempting to answer. So we have there is a kind of a pot of funding at the department earmarked for ag leadership, and typically state funds are really restricted on what exactly you can do with them. This happens to be, don't tell anyone at the state legislature, but this happens to be pretty flexible, with ag leadership being the only sort of requirement. So in the past, it's, we've said, well, training farmers and ranchers is ag leadership, so we're going to use these to increase the funding available for ag workforce. But we've also funded things like grants to FFA Foundation, and they help students who are doing SAE projects with expenses associated with that. Or the 4-H Foundation has had funds from this program before. But it's very much just in the concept phase. We're thinking about what we have this fund available, what can we do to make a difference with it in addition to ag workforce. So we've talked about whether there are maybe scholarship opportunities if somebody wanted to attend conferences or trainings, or even formal educational programs. Could we provide scholarship funding for that? If someone wanted to participate on a board or commission, and there's a cost associated with that, travel expenses to and from meetings, and anything that would be a barrier for a young or beginning farmer or rancher to participate on some type of board or commission, could we cover the expenses of that? But really, it's pretty broad, and we're in the brainstorming phase. So I would love to hear from you all if there are, if anything pops in your head that could be useful that fits under ag leadership pretty broadly.
I mean, just for me thinking about it, it was like, I was really interested in, we talk a lot, especially in the Young Farmer Coalition, about creating sort of mentorships between people who are just starting out, especially in business and employment on their farms, and creating mentorships between them and people that have a lot more experience, and who may be transitioning into retirement or something like that. So I don't know if there's a way for the program to kind of facilitate that. Sometimes those people can be hard to find or hard to reach, for young farmers. But so valuable to have, their expertise, whether just because it's so place based and specific. So
Right. Well, I love that idea. And I think the idea of this grant program is to, if there was an organization or individual who was interested in putting together sort of a mentorship program like that, they could submit a project proposal and fund that. So I think my goal is to keep it pretty broad so that any idea like that fits, and to make this also really accessible. You don't have to be a professional grant writer in order to access these funds. So those are certainly things I will keep in mind. And I love those thoughts. So feel free, those are the kinds of things, feel free to send to me if you have thoughts that pop up as you go through the next weeks or months. This is probably going to be, a few months down the road before we're ready to release it, but we'll take all the feedback we can get before then. And we'll probably do some formal, feedback seeking.
Gosh, can you hear me, guys? Just saying thank you. And does anybody have further questions? We do have another presentation coming up right at 12:05. So get your questions in now, and otherwise we can take a break, and see how it goes on this next presentation from CDLE.
Great, thank you all. Nice to see so many faces, Chrisanne and Taylor and Meg. Haven't seen you all for a while. Well, Taylor, I saw you this week.
Yeah, but thanks for being here. This is really awesome.
Great, thank you all. Have a good day.
Welcome back, everybody. Our next presenter is Eric Yohe, and he is with the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. He's the outreach manager at the Division of Labor Standards and Statistics, and he's going to talk about the new ag workers' rights bill for us. And I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess it just turned into afternoon. Thank you all for having me today. My name is Eric Yohe. I'm with the Colorado Division of Labor Standards and Statistics, which is part of the bigger Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. So in a half hour here, have to be fairly high level in terms of explaining the new laws, and I also want to bring in a little bit of history, but I also want to make sure you have time for questions here at the end. So forgive me if I go fairly quickly. Okay, so very brief history, and this is really important, I think, for this group to understand this. And I should have a white screen here that says brief history retail employers. Is that correct?
We actually see your email window.
That's
open.
weird. All right, well, let's try to reshare then. How's that?
There you go.
Perfect. Apologize for that. So one real quick piece that we found as we've been providing education on this new law and the rules that are associated with it is that we needed to re-educate folks in terms of the previous exemptions or just laws not applying to what we would call jobs in agriculture and the agricultural industry. Going back at least 20 years or more, any employer in the state of Colorado, any private employer in the state of Colorado whose revenue was derived of 50% of more from retail sales, meaning direct to consumer, especially including through farmers markets for those in the agricultural space, have always been covered, or for the last 20 years at least, have always been covered by what's called the minimum wage order, or now the comps order, and have had to provide minimum wage overtime and break requirements, meet break requirements. So anyone whose model is a retail model, or at least 50% of the revenue is from retail sales, is already required to provide the more stringent overtime and minimum wage and break protections that are afforded to almost all other employees in the state. So I wanted to get that out of the way in case anyone is working in that space. Brief history: in 2020, March of 2020, the division went on a kind of revamping of minimum wage and overtime protections in Colorado. And we called it the Colorado Overtime and Minimum Pay Standards Order. Since March 2020, modified rest break or rest period protection has been in effect for agricultural employees. There's rest breaks averaging 10 minutes for every 4 hours work. That has been in effect. We found that some folks weren't aware that's been in effect since March 2020. But jobs in agriculture remained exempt from minimum wage, overtime, and meal period requirements. Just a very quick history to get you to where we're at now. And then where we're at now is what everyone lovingly calls SB 87. The Colorado, there's no actual title to the bill itself, to the act itself. So if anyone who uses a title, Agricultural Workers Bill of Rights, or whatever they may use, it's actually not the title of the bill, but it is a broad expansion of protections for agricultural workers. And because of that broad expansion, it is also provides a lot more responsibilities in terms of employers in this space. What it does, it eliminated any agricultural exemptions from minimum wages. Not all agricultural employers were exempt already. It depended on their size to some extent and whether or not they had to pay minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But in this space, overtime wages have never applied. And that was probably the big piece, and it required our division to do rulemaking over with regard to overtime. And we'll spend quite a bit of time on that, or as much as we can. It did add what every other private employee in the state has in terms of a protection of a 30-minute unpaid meal period. That is a piece in there. And it also opened up the ability for agricultural workers to unionize and have related labor organizing activity. Also provided for the division to add, and Colorado Department of Agriculture as well, to add new rules on work conditions. That includes heat protection, which we'll talk about, access to service providers, hoeing and weeding, which was probably talked about in an earlier presentation today, I think, which is covered by the rules were actually done by the Colorado Department of Agriculture. And then some housed workers' rights, and we'll talk a tiny bit about that. So in practice, it's easy to see, oh, that's not too much on a screen. In practice, we understand it's a lot. We absolutely do. And we're going to do the best we can over time, and we're not finished, trying to make sure both employers and workers understand the requirements of the new law. Okay, implementation timeline. What we're doing right now, we're doing what I'm doing with you all. We're trying to educate everybody about the law. Want to make sure everyone knows that rest and meal period requirements are already in effect. We just adopted last week, I guess it's now 2 weeks as of this coming Monday, the agricultural labor conditions rules are out on our website. I'll make sure everyone has a link to that. And we're currently creating educational materials. We're a little behind on that because the way rulemaking works, we couldn't really publish any additional education materials until those rules were in effect, or not in effect, but adopted. So we're continuing to publish educational materials. Some of you may know that we had something called an info as we were doing the rulemaking process. It basically helped people understand what my division's responsibilities were in terms of rulemaking and how that was going to work. Now that the rulemaking process is over, we're putting together materials to make sure workers and employers understand the laws and rules. Okay. On May 1st, the labor condition rules go into effect. These are the rules that were just adopted on January 31st. They include rules regarding heat, illness, and injury protection, the requirements regard shade, drinking water, and additional breaks depending on the conditions, and then certain service provider access as well. And then, not that this isn't big, that's really big new protections for employees, but what's kind of overwhelmed anything else and any other discussion with regard to this law is overtime. And the first piece of overtime becomes effective on November 1st of 2022. That's when overtime phases in. The overtime threshold, meaning how many hours an employee works before they hit having to pay overtime, depends on the type of employer, and we'll talk about that in a bit. This is a little overwhelming slide. This actually comes straight from our comps order. In comps order, it's in just plain black and white. And I've played back and forth with just giving you the black and white version or trying to do a little bit of color coded piece. Basically, as we go through here, anything that's shaded in blue is what employers must provide after the phase in ends. So up until November 1st of this year, no overtime is required for agricultural employees. Beginning November 1st, it begins to phase in. So for all employers, they must provide overtime after 60 hours are worked in a work week. And overtime is time and a half. Time and a half their regular wage. Daily overtime is a little complex. I actually don't know how often this will come into play. It will depend, I imagine, on the particular employer. There isn't necessarily, so for non-agricultural employers that are covered by the comps order, they must pay overtime after 12 hours in a workday or in a consecutive shift. We did not add that for agricultural workers. What we added instead was after 12 hours of work daily, an additional 30-minute paid break must be provided. Okay, after 15 hours, an employer can work an employee past 15 hours, but in addition to that 30-minute paid break at 12 hours, the employee is entitled to an extra hour's pay at least whatever the minimum wage is at that time. The minimum wage this year is $12.56. So beginning in November, if there is a 15-hour workday, then an employer must actually provide another hour. You can actually see the point here, trying to put in a little bit disincentive as the day's hours get longer, as the employee works more hours in a given workday. So that's what applies to everyone until January 1st, 2024. So we're still a long ways away, but the questions we get are almost all about overtime. So I wanted to make sure you understand how the overtime is going to work. And there's also a piece that makes overtime really important, because depending on what you want to do with how you want to work your business. Um, you always need to be recording employees' hours, but recording how many hours they work is actually integral in determining whether or not an employer is a highly seasonal employer or a small employer for the purposes of these phase-ins. So I have a slide coming up that talks about highly seasonal versus small employer. But note that when overtime goes into effect in 2024, if an employer is a highly seasonal employer, for up to 22 weeks that they identify as their peak season, and it can be broken up into up to 3 different periods. It doesn't have to be 22 weeks at all, in all one chunk, and it doesn't have to be a full 22 weeks. Someone can choose to have if what their business is, it's truly seasonal for 12 weeks out of the year. That's all they'll be able to claim in terms of this relief in terms of overtime. So beginning in 2024, highly seasonal employers during that seasonal time frame are required to pay overtime after 56 hours in a work week. And in non-peak seasons, any non-peak weeks, that's after 48 hours in a work week. And that's what it will be beginning January 1st, 2024 and on. For an employer who doesn't have a peak season, is not able, and we'll talk about the calculation here in a second, not able to claim any sort of peak weeks throughout the year. In 2024, it's going to phase down to 54 hours in a work week until overtime kicks in, and then goes to the same 48-hour work week, 48 hours per work week for overtime in 2025. Okay, so then small employers, you'll notice, phase in a little differently. In 2024, it's going to be 56-hour week for overtime. And then after that point in 2025, small employers will apply either the highly seasonal or the non-highly seasonal rate, depending on their circumstances. A lot of information there. I'm going to make sure that you all have this presentation and are able to take a look at it. Highly seasonal agricultural employer. And if as a business you plan on claiming peak weeks for the purposes of overtime, this is really important. An agricultural employer, to be highly seasonal, must have at least twice as many employees within the identified 22-week or smaller period than the rest of the year. So it's truly a peak season, or maybe it's 2 peak seasons. Maybe it's at planting and it's at harvesting, or whatever it might be. But it can be no more than 22 weeks, and it must be the employer must have twice as many employees as they do during the rest of the year. I'm going to explain how to count that in just a second. Employers must provide initial disclosure at least annually to their employees that there will be overtime that will be paid after 56 hours per work week instead of the 48. And they must provide a written notice within 1 week of the start of the peak season of what weeks those peak weeks will be. We understand weather changes things. We understand lots. Supply may change things, whatever it might be. So the notice in terms of identifying the weeks just must be 1 week prior. And then all required notices must be in English and any language that is the first language spoken by at least 5% of the employer's workforce. As we get closer and those notices become required, we can likely help with getting things translated into Spanish or other languages as necessary. Okay. I've just been going straight through. Why don't I just finish up, and then we'll see how much time we have for questions. So basically it works like this. If an employee works over 35 hours in a week, that's considered one employee for that week. So each employee that works more than 35 hours is one employee. If they're essentially part-time, 15 to 35, it's half employee. If it's less than 15, it's 0 employees. So you would add up those weeks that have those weeks, you add up the weeks that you think that are your peak weeks. And if you have twice as many employees working for you as you do in the non-peak weeks, then you qualify for the highly seasonal exemption. I understand there's some math there as we get closer, but we're a bit far out. We will definitely have some examples as to what that's going to look like. And then in small employer definition, if the employers employ fewer than 4 employees on average over the 3 prior calendar years and have averaged an average adjusted gross income over the 3 prior complete taxable years of no more than $1 million. I know that's a lot of words, but it seems like for what we saw and what we heard is that for those employers who are truly small farms, truly small employers, that this would be pretty easy to identify that they're a small employer. I don't bring up here the concept of the family farm and the exemptions for family working on the family farm. If you have questions about that, you'll have my contact information. Make sure to reach out to me and I can help you with that. Okay, lots of resources. You will have access to these resources. So before we get into the resources, any questions about anything I've talked about today?
I just would like to hear from folks on the call if, you know, I know some people do employ others and some people don't. I think that most of us would consider ourselves small employers. Is anybody here employing more than 4 people in a season? Okay. Just, you know, just so we know kind of where we're at in that.
Well, thank you for the help there. I didn't realize I misunderstood the scope. So thank you.
No. It's good to know the rules. I really appreciate that. But I just want people to know that there's that threshold, and most of us are either not employing any people yet, or we'd be small.
Right. So I will have available these resources, and please pop up in the chat any questions you have, or just chime in. But while we're waiting, all of these resources are what we've talked about. The Agricultural Labor Conditions Rule, which I actually currently adopted. We will have an info that will be available this month. We call our fact sheets infos. We'll have it will take what I did and probably distill it much better than I did in these last 25 minutes or so. The Colorado overtime and minimum pay standards basically include all the agricultural specific rules when it comes to wage and hour type requirements, overtime, rest of meal periods, minimum wage, anything like that. And that has its own fact sheet as well. I also want to make sure you have my contact information, and like I said, I'll provide a PDF of this set of slides, which is a little different than what I provided to you, Shan. So we are available if you have questions. There's an email address there. There's our call center number, or if you have something very specific, especially as a follow-up to our meeting today, feel free to reach out to me and I can help you as best I can. But like I said, I will create a PDF of this and I'll get it out right after this session ends.
Eric, I have a quick question for you.
Of course.
In our last presentation, we were in terms of designating agricultural workers and non-agricultural workers, that there's a piece, I guess, that's called range workers.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that? Or like, I was trying to find a definition. I couldn't find a definition.
Well, I can actually find a definition for you really quickly. Let me unshare and share. But essentially, that range worker, if you're an employer with range workers, you generally know about it. Because most of those they're mainly sheep herders for the most part, and most of them are actually employing their workers under H-2A visas.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's what I was assuming, like the, a lot of the like Peruvian folks who come and do the sheep herding. I think that's more of like and they're really like out there. They're not like living on the farm and just working with the cattle. But yeah, I would love the definition of that.
Okay. Okay, let me go ahead and share, unless you're seeing a big white and black page in front of you. I don't think you probably are. Let me reshare. Oh, it looks like you should be seeing this. So
Yep, got it.
that's a lot of words. It basically means an agricultural employee who is paid this minimum monthly salary that we have in another document. And the language is someone principally engaged in the range production of livestock on the open range. And they must be provided with housing, food, transportation, and equipment. Actually, they just basically need to meet the H-2A visa range workers regulations, as well as be paid the minimum salary that we set.
So is this this actual PDF? Is this the actual legislation, and you can just go down to the definitions portion?
So this is what's called the comps order. So the legislation required us to do required my division do a lot of rulemaking, and part of that rulemaking included providing a minimum salary for range workers. So what we're actually looking at here from that definition is in the comps order, not in the legislation itself. Perfect.
Awesome. I have another question too, Eric. We actually didn't hear much about the short-handled hoe and hand weeding. Could you go over that a little bit, and maybe also some of the organic farms?
So I hate to pass on that, but I'm really not up to speed on that. It's really no excuse, but that really does fall under the authority of the Colorado Department of Agriculture, especially when it comes to the waivers. We will have information about that, but with all the varying responsibilities and rights that were handed down by this law, that is something I don't have a good handle on. No pun intended at this point.
Okay, no worries. I just want to let people know that part of the Ag Workers' Rights Bill, or SB 87, was to outlaw in majority of circumstances the use of the short-handled hoe. So it's very specific. And there also are exemptions from some of that. Sorry about my cat. There are exemptions for some of the hand weeding and short-handled hoe use stuff for organic farms, certified organic farms.
Right.
So
I do know that a piece of that is that they don't have to be certified organic if they're in the middle of that process.
Oh, if they're transitioning.
If they're transitioning.
Okay.
But yeah, the bulk of what I know and what I know from the testimony that was provided is that the intent was to mimic California on this, and basically from the standpoint of trying to minimize stooping as much as possible on the workers.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate being invited. And like I said, I'll make sure that you have my contact information. I'll get this PDF out, and I assume that will be distributed out to the attendees. But I don't want to push you back. I don't know if you have any more, if you have a session right after this, so I don't want to put you behind at all.
I think we're good, unless anybody has any further questions for Eric. We're gonna go ahead and do our wrap up with Jody. He's got a few more slides for us. So get your questions into Eric now, unless you don't have any.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Eric. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Well, I think we are just going to roll right into it with Jody. Jody's got a few more slides for us about immigration law and a few other things. And then hopefully we can, you know, answer any questions that came up for you guys, or at least give you some a direction to go to answer those questions.
Okay, yeah, we'll just push through these last couple of issues real quick. I wanted to touch on immigration law compliance because that's another matter that trips up every employer or applies to every employer and trips up some employers. Key piece here is that employers may hire only persons who are authorized to work in the United States. If you learn of an employee's status that they're not authorized, contact legal counsel immediately. It's the penalties that are associated with knowingly hiring or maintaining as an employee an unauthorized worker are pretty high, both civil penalties and potential criminal penalties. So it's not something you want to mess around with. You verify your work authorization at the beginning of employment with an I-9 form. I'm sure that almost all of you have filled one of those out at some point. You have to keep an I-9 on record for every employee for 3 years or 1 year after employment, whichever is longer. And I include a link here to where you can look to see what are acceptable documents when you request that an employee fills out an I-9. Presidential administrations change, enforcement remains. One thing you can do to add an additional layer of security, or if you just want to sleep at night a little bit more peacefully, you can do E-Verify as well. It's an internet-based system that compares information from the Department of Homeland Security and Social Security Administration to the documents that you're provided by your employee. Like I said, just an additional layer of security. You don't have to do it at this point. But if you run into an ICE audit or something like that, it will be an extra defense for you if you're performing E-Verify for your employees if there's a violation. The fines for I-9 violations and immigration compliance law violations increased in October. If you have a paperwork violation, so even if you don't have any unauthorized workers working for you, you could still be subject to a fine if your paperwork's not correct. So the potential paperwork violations, $237 to $2,360 per violation. The fines below are if you knowingly hire, recruit, refer, or retain an unauthorized worker. Each offense, it's going to increase to the point where, third and subsequent, you're looking thousands of dollars for each unauthorized worker. And like I said, there are potential criminal ramifications there too. There are steps you can take to prepare yourself for a potential ICE audit. We saw, and this is another political thing, it ramps up under certain presidential administrations, they ramp up the audits, then they'll back off. Under President Trump, we saw a huge increase in ICE audits, both raids of workplaces as well as I-9 audits. They've backed off a little bit since President Biden took office, but this is something that goes up and down. Regardless, you should be taking steps to prepare yourself. One of the things is just being aware of your compliance obligations, emphasizing the importance of the I-9 form and correctly having your employees correctly complete those and maintaining those records as you're required to do. That they must be completed in a timely fashion, in most cases on the first day of employment. As I said on a previous slide, significant fines and penalties if you fail to comply with these requirements, even if you don't have an unauthorized worker in your workforce. So Just make sure that you're taking this seriously. You can conduct a self-audit and review your records on a fairly regular basis. If you receive a notice of inspection from ICE, contact legal counsel as soon as possible, so that your rights are protected. I'll talk about a few recent changes to Colorado state law. The Equal Pay for Equal Work Act went into effect January 1st, 2021. It applies to any employer in Colorado that employs at least one employee. There are record keeping and job description requirements. You have to keep wage rate histories for the duration of your employee's employment plus 2 years after. The purpose of the law is to prohibit paying one employee less than a same or similar employee of a different sex or gender absent a legally justifiable reason. So it doesn't mean you have to pay everybody the same, but if you have differences in wages between similar employees, you have to have some sort of business or legal justification for doing so. And those are listed out in the law, but they're pretty straightforward. It's seniority differences, educational, experiential differences. You can justify differences in pay. Just make sure that you're thinking about this and you're cognizant of it. And if you do have pay differences between employees, that you can justify it. A few other things that this law does: you can't ask applicants about their salary history anymore. You can't prohibit your employees from talking about wages. That was prohibited by federal labor law anyway, but this makes it clear that Colorado state law also prohibits employers from not allowing employees to talk about their wages amongst themselves or retaliating against employees for talking about wages. The law also includes job posting requirements. So whenever you post a job opening, you have to include the compensation amount in the job posting or a range of compensation. You have to include the benefits. And this is for any job that can be performed by Colorado employees. It may not apply here, but if you had remote positions that you're a multi-state employer and you had employees outside of Colorado that could perform the job, or even if a job is physically located outside of the state, but it can be remotely completed by a Colorado employee, you still have to meet these job posting requirements. Also includes a requirement that if you have promotional opportunities for certain employees, so if you're posting an opening for a new job and it would be considered a promotional job opportunity or promotional opportunity for some of your employees, you have to announce the promotional opportunity to all of your employees on the same day. And the whole purpose of this, like I said, is to sort of level the playing field in the workplace. It's one of the strictest pay equity laws in the country. And the violations they can be serious. They're between $500 to $10,000 per violation. And that includes for job posting violations. So make sure you understand that you do have new obligations with job postings, asking about salary histories, things like that. And make sure that you can justify your pay differences between employees. Healthy Families and Workplaces Act is another law that went into effect. As of January 1st of this year, it applies to all Colorado employers, regardless of size. It imposes a general paid sick leave obligation on employers. You have to provide 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked, up to 48 hours annually. And you have to allow your employees to carry over up to 48 hours of paid sick leave from 1 year to the next. Now you can cap it at 48 hours, and I recommend that you do, so that your employees can't just accrue an unlimited amount of paid sick leave. This is a little different than paid vacation or PTO, although you can have a PTO policy that covers both paid vacation and paid sick leave, and you can satisfy your obligations under the Healthy Families and Workplaces Act. But as far as you don't have to pay this out at termination, it's a little bit different than paid vacation. One thing to keep in mind, employees begin to earn paid sick leave under this law immediately upon hire, and they can use it once it's accrued. So that's one of the questions I've gotten from a lot of clients. This guy's only been here 30 days, and he called in sick. Do I have to provide him paid sick leave? So yes, once they start working for you, you have to start allowing them to accrue paid sick leave under the law. It also includes a supplemental paid sick leave requirement that during a period of a federally declared public health emergency or a state declared disaster emergency, you have to supplement their paid sick leave up to 80 hours if the employee has symptoms or a family member who's sick with whatever the disease is that caused the public health emergency or disaster emergency. So right now, we're actually still in the midst of a federally declared public health emergency. The Department of Health and Human Services secretary declared a public health emergency at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and he's been expanding that every 90 days since. So we're actually still in a period where employers have to provide supplemental paid sick leave under Colorado law for COVID-related reasons. Even though there's no federal requirement, employers still have to provide it under state law. The next one, the next big one that's on the horizon, and this doesn't go into effect until, there's no obligations until January 1st of 2023, is the Family and Medical Leave Insurance Act. This stands up a whole new division within the Colorado Department of Labor to administer paid family medical leave for all Colorado employees. Employers are going to begin funding this program on January 1st, 2023. So next year, and then employees can begin to use paid family medical leave beginning January 1st, 2024. So for the first 2 years of the program, premiums will be 0.9% of the employee wages, which by the statute is split 50-50 between the employer and the employee. Employers can choose to pay more of that if they wish, but they don't have to. Essentially what it does is it provides up to 12 weeks of paid family leave. So it's FMLA leave essentially on a state level, but it's going to be paid, and it will be administered by a state agency. So the employee will actually apply for benefits from the state agency as opposed to the employer. So kind of an interesting one there, but that's on the horizon. Employees won't be able to start taking that paid family and medical leave until 2024. And one of the reasons we've seen so many changes in Colorado state law, as I mentioned earlier, labor and employment's it's a political creature. We see massive swings back and forth, depending on whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration in charge. One of the reasons we've seen so many changes on a state level is because it's the first time in decades that we've had one party control of state government. So, we've seen a bunch of changes. It's one of the reasons that, we recommend that you stay on top of these and keep your handbooks updated, because labor and employment laws are constantly going back and forth. So, but these are some big ones. It's been a very active couple of years in labor and employment law in Colorado. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Well, awesome. I wanted to just, first of all, thank everybody for being here and for sitting through this. It's so hard. It's so much stuff to take in all at once, and I totally get it. But I want to really encourage you guys that this session was not meant to discourage you from employing people. It was just meant to let you know what it is that you're embarking on. And also, so many of the things that we talked about today probably don't apply to your particular situation. We just wanted to make sure we covered all the situations that could potentially arise for you. And I just want to say that I've employed people in the past. I've done all this stuff. I've done the unemployment insurance. I've done the workers' comp insurance. I've done the payroll. I've done, the timekeeping and everything like that. And while it's, and many of us are doing this on our own. And I understand that that's hard to wrap your head around. But once you do it and you can do it, it becomes much more routine. And much more just, something that you need to know about and keep track of, like Jody's saying, keep on top of it, know what the law is. But once you have those systems in place, it's really not, you know, gonna take you 4 hours of your Saturday, you know, most of the time to do it. And especially if you consider getting some help with some of those administrative duties, you know. So, and there's payroll services. And then I hope that what I can do and what we can do as the education committee for the Young Farmers Coalition is come up with like a really good sort of, you know, step-by-step roadmap for you to become an employer in agriculture. And that will be geared toward us as very small employers. So I'm really grateful to have, you know, gotten this far today. I think we all did a great job. Thank you, Jody, for making it, you know, interesting and also giving us that broad overview that we really needed. So again, I just want to say to everybody, it is so worth it to have employees on your farm. It feels like a lot of stuff from right now, from this point, you're going to be like, oh, I'm never going to do it. I'm never going to do it. I can't possibly, you know, but you can. And it's so amazing. Like, not only do you get to have that relationship with, you know, those people, you also really get to expand the capacity of your business and what you can do and how much you can make. And so I really encourage you, just from like a personal growth perspective and from a business growth perspective, to really consider having employees. It's a lot to take on from the legal perspective, but it is very, very worth it. So I just wanted to say that because it, again, wasn't meant to scare you, just to tell you what you should be prepared for. So I'd love to hear what anybody's responses are and kind of like, what are you worried about and how did this land for you? I'm very curious.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Helen said. I mean, it is a process, but it's totally doable, and there are resources to help you. And you know, as long as you're cognizant of these issues, and like you said, this may not apply to your situation, but I just kind of want to put these points in your mind in case at some point they do, in case you grow and you know, you find yourself in a different situation. You know, you think, oh my gosh, Jody said this a year ago. Maybe I should think about this one issue. And as long as, you know, you're kind of cognizant of the fact that there are issues out there, and in certain areas of the law, you'll be fine. You guys have a great group here, you know, to bounce ideas off each other, find people that are doing the same thing as you are, reach out to legal counsel if you need to. There's an organization called Mountain States Employers Council that provides some great advice. It's kind of an HR company that a lot of folks use around here for questions with employees, but it's totally doable. And you know, if there's any way I could ever help any of you, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm here for you.
Thank you. We did have a couple questions come in on the chat. So one is, what is a general rule of thumb for overall costs to hire a part-time employee? For example, 1.25% of actual hourly wage, higher or lower. Do you have any insight on that, Jody? I know it's more of a bookkeeping question.
Yeah, I don't. Sorry.
Okay. There are.
I don't tell you how to run your business. I just tell you how to not get sued.
Right. There are some calculators out there that can help you. I recently went through this myself and actually did so because of the Ag Workforce Development Program. It was sort of helped me figure out like what are the additional costs. I think that's high. 1.25% is a little high. Maybe 15% extra. I'm not really sure. There are some calculators out there though that can, like online calculators that can help you with that. You know, what are the costs of taxes and insurance, et cetera, on top of my wages? We have another question here. It says, curious if participants here who have employees do their own payroll versus hiring out this responsibility. So do any of us have employees? Meg, do you hire out your payroll to someone else?
Yes, we have an accountant who runs our payroll for us as well. And so it kind of depends to how you classify yourself, but like I absolutely have to have it because I can't write myself my own paycheck. So I have to have a third party payroll person doing that so I can also get a paycheck. So yeah, it kind of depends on your situation, but I totally recommend paying a little bit to somebody else to handle all the payroll taxes and like all that kind of stuff for you.
Yeah, and in my experience, it's been just going through a payroll service, like, you know, QuickBooks has just an add-on for your payroll, and it helps you figure out your taxes, and it reminds you when you have reporting, and when to put in your W-2s and stuff. So, you know, it's not all, it doesn't have to be all on you to remember all these dates and all of the filing requirements that you have. There's a lot of ways that that's, you know, semi-automated.
Yeah, I don't have employees, but I've built a relationship with a bookkeeper and she does also tax accounting. So I do everything all year, and then she just like cleans it up because I'm inevitably make mistakes. So I imagine if I had payroll, we would just kind of meet every month or so. And she's just like a small business accountant here in Lyons and has like taught me how to do bookkeeping essentially. And so, and it's nice to have that backup, like really, if there's a red flag, you're missing something really huge, you have some professional behind you instead of just doing QuickBooks for years and years and then figuring out you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and on the QuickBooks note, like we use QuickBooks also. So I do have that other person that's doing it, but I can go in and see everything too. So, you know, it's not like that scary that you're handing it all over to somebody else. You can check on them pretty easily.
Cool. Did you have something, Shannon?
I was just wondering, Taylor, if you'd be willing to share your person, or if anybody has a good bookkeeper / accountant that they would share.
Totally. Yeah, mine's right here in Lyons. I don't know where you're located, but she's right here in town, and I'll share her information here.
And a lot of folks in my circle use Adam. I'm not actually sure how to spell his last name, but I'll put it in here. It's Waxel, something like that. And he runs Green Thumb Accounting and works specifically with farmers. So I can recommend him. Awesome. So, and Taylor just threw Julie her information there in the chat, and that's Adam Waxel, Green Thumb Accounting. Oops, you know what I meant. So cool. Well, do you guys have any more legal questions for Jody? Was there anything? I know that there was a lot in that whole presentation. Oh, we just had one from Chris Ann. So Chris Ann asks, Jody, in the last presentation, there was a reference to if you work less than 15 hours, you're not an employee. Is that just specific to that bill?
Yeah, so that has to do with counting employees to determine whether or not you are a small employer for overtime requirements. So that I think it's 35 or more is 1, 15 to 35 is half, and less than 15 is 0. That's strictly for the overtime counting requirements to see if you're in that small employer category.
Yeah, and again, I think, you know, all of us would be small employers, right? Nobody's employing over 4 people, except maybe Meg. I don't know.
I do employ more than 4 people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't make $1 million. So is it like an and or an or? I felt bad jumping in because I was like the only one, but
it's an and. It's an and. So you have to have less than 4 and make less than $1 million.
Okay.
So if I have more than 4, but I don't make $1 million,
you're going to either be a highly seasonal or a non-highly seasonal employer.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm highly seasonal based on what I've read through.
Yeah. So, and I know that all that stuff is difficult. It's a lot to kind of do all the rules, right, guys? But again, that's why we want to make this roadmap for everybody. So are there any further questions right now for Jody? Because I also wanted to sort of just summarize a few of the things that we went through and make sure that I've got it right in my head, and hopefully that will help you guys. But are there some more specific questions? Like Jade, do you have anything that you'd like to ask? Okay. I don't want to call you out. I just was curious.
No, it's
So you-
fine. I'm just super overwhelmed right now with like literally everything we talked about. So I don't know that I have a question, just like complete brain exploding out of my head situation.
That wasn't the point.
We know it wasn't the point, Jody. So that's why I wanted to kind of just like do a little roundup real quick. So for me, you know, I am considering hiring people. I am hiring people this season. So I'm going to have somebody who's going to be here for 30 hours a week on the farm at the minimum. She's going to start working in the middle of March. And so I know that what I need to do is I need to go ahead and get an account with the unemployment insurance division. I need to also, you know, make sure that my Department of Revenue account is in place and up to date, and that I'm registered like as an employer with the state of Colorado, right? I need to, once I've got her going, I can report her to the new hires division. I need to make sure I'm going to call my insurance, you know, that I currently have for the farm and for my vehicles. And I'm going to say, hey, do you offer a workers' comp? And maybe there's like a package deal that I can get when I do workers' comp through them. Or I can do workers' comp through the, you know, main deal, which is Pinnacle Assurance, which I've used before. And I'm going to make sure that I have like, and I already have done this for her, but I have a really clear job description for her. And I have, you know, her expectations of her hourly, you know, pay. I just have an agreement. It's not an employment contract. It's just sort of a memorandum of understanding of like, this is the deal. And, you know, and I have some policies on there. Like I have a social media policy. I also have a, you know, I own the work that is done on the farm or in my flower studio. So that like that work always belongs to the business, right? So I've laid that out for my employee. And then I know that I'm going to probably be paying quarterly wage withholding just because I have one employee and my liability likely isn't over $7,000 a quarter. And then I know I'm going to, at the end of next year, I'm going to have to submit a W-2 for my employee. Yeah. And so kind of like, those are some little steps that I'm going to make sure that I take. And I'm curious what you think I'm missing, Jody.
W-4s?
W-4s. I'm going to get a W-4 from her and an I-9.
Yep. Other than that, I mean, I think you have it pretty much covered.
Great. So, and then we got another question. Are there other good options besides Pinnacle for workers' comp insurance?
I talked to your like your commercial general liability insurer. If you have just an insurance plan for your business, see if they offer it. Honestly, probably 80 to 90% of the employers in Colorado use Pinnacle.
Yeah. It just kind of depends for you. Like, it's just, I think it's just easy because Pinnacle's like maybe the one they direct you to on the site. And then, you know, but you might as well go ahead and call your current insurer if you have one, and just see, do you offer workers' comp? And it might be cheaper for you because of that, of a package deal.
And they might, I mean, they may not offer it in Colorado. It's a state by state deal. You know, if they may offer it in other states, but not Colorado. So you're just gonna have to check.
Okay, good to know. Oh, so I know we're at the end of our time here, and thank you all so much for sticking it out. You guys are rock stars. I really hope it helps you. Please like reach out to me or Jody or, you know, Sean, and let's see if we can help you get there for employment, you know, and help it not be so scary. It really is awesome. You get to help people become farmers. That's amazing. So I highly recommend it. I also wanted to just let you know that there is our event coming up on the 26th. So that is shared on the screen right now. How to Boss. the roundtable discussion, talking to seasoned farmers, new interns, and farm employees about everything from hiring tips and time tracking to more like communication styles, burnout. Do we have a career? How do we employ and retain people over the winter? So we've got a lot going on there. That's another. You can join by Zoom, but we are going to have it in person at the Left Hand Grange, and there's going to be like 2 hours of a roundtable discussion and then 2 hours of sort of integration and exercises, so some role playing and stuff like that, so that you can get a good handle on how to like deal with conflict, make sure your employees feel valued and loved, and that we can create healthy workplaces on our farms. Then we also have electrical skills for the farm on March 10th, which is exciting. That's going to be taught by our new treasurer, Chris Borky, and he's going to help us figure out, how do we use a multimeter and stuff like that. So just troubleshooting electrical tools and circuits on our farms. So that'll be fun. Awesome. Well, I don't want to keep anybody. Please have a wonderful, wonderful Saturday. Jody, thank you so much for this. It was really great. Just a really great primer for all of us. And we're going to refer back to that, those slides, and hopefully, get people on their way to being employers. So thank you.
Happy to help. Good to meet all you guys.
Thank you so much, Jody.
Mhm.
Take care, everybody. Have a great Saturday. See you soon.
See ya.
Oh, I want to let you know, we're the survey just went out into your inboxes, so please take the survey. It really helps us with our BOCO grant reporting. Thank you. All right, bye.
Thank you.